Dear friend, if you are listening to this in the dark, with the day still running somewhere behind your eyes, welcome. You do not have to do anything right now, not even this. Perhaps you know the particular exhaustion of a mind that will not stop totaling its own report card, the list of what was finished today, and the longer list of what was not. The small voice that says, even now, lying still, that you have not yet done enough to deserve to lie still. Perhaps your body has been asking for rest for hours, and some older, sterner part of you keeps answering, not yet, not yet, you haven't earned it. Here is a strange thought to carry into the dark with you tonight, one that asks nothing of you and proves nothing to anyone. What if rest was never a wage you had to work for? What if it was never something you needed to qualify for, the way you qualify for a loan or a promotion or your own mother's approval? What if rest is not a reward waiting at the far end of enough effort, but something closer to weather, something that simply arrives, the way evening arrives, whether or not the fields are finished? The moon does not work to shine on the water. It does not strain or earn its place there or prove itself worthy of the river. The water, too, does not have to try to hold the moon's reflection. It only has to stop being so disturbed. It only has to grow still enough, and the moon is already there, the way it was always going to be there. Tonight, we will visit a small thatched hermitage by a river in the soft, early days of spring, where the water is just beginning to run faster with melted snow from somewhere up in the hills, and the plum trees are deciding, slowly, whether or not it is finally warm enough to bloom. An old teacher lives there, the kind who has stopped needing to be right about anything. And on this particular morning, a scholar is walking up the path toward the hermitage door, his arms so full of books and papers and notes to himself that he can hardly see over the top of them. You do not have to believe any of this yet. You only have to listen, the way you might listen to rain on a roof, without needing to understand exactly how rain works, in order to feel, in your body, that it is safe, and that it will pass, and that you do not have to do anything at all to make it stop or start. Let the stories tonight do their slow work the same way. There is nothing here to study. There is nowhere you need to arrive by the end. There is only this voice, low and unhurried, and the long, soft dark around you, and a very old story about to begin. Let me tell you of the scholar and his cup, and what the old teacher poured into it. Once, in the misty hills above a slow green river, there lived an old teacher whom the villagers simply called the abbot, though he kept no great temple and rang no great bell. His home was a one-room hermitage with a sagging roof and a small clay stove, and his only visible wealth was a stand of new bamboo growing crookedly outside his door and a single cracked teapot that he refused, despite many gentle offers, to replace. One morning in early spring, a scholar came walking up the muddy path from the village below. He was young, perhaps 30, with ink-stained fingers and the particular pallor of a man who reads more than he sleeps. He carried with him a leather satchel stuffed so full of papers that its buckle had long since stopped closing properly, and tucked under one arm, 3 more books, their spines cracked from rereading. He had walked 2 days to reach this hermitage, having heard that the old abbot here held some secret to peace that the scholar, despite years of study, had not yet found written down anywhere. The abbot was kneeling by his small garden when the scholar arrived, turning the early soil with a wooden trowel, in no apparent hurry to notice his visitor. The scholar stood at the edge of the garden for a long moment, shifting the weight of his books, before he finally spoke. "Venerable teacher," he said, and he heard his own voice come out thinner than he intended. "I have read everything I can find. The sutras, the commentaries on the sutras, the commentaries on the commentaries, and I have copied out every teaching on peace of mind that exists in the capital's libraries, twice, in my own hand, so that I might understand it more deeply, and still, peace will not come to me. My mind will not be still. I have come a long way to ask you what I am missing." The abbot looked up at him, not unkindly, and set down his trowel. "You have come a long way," he agreed. "Come inside. We will have tea before we speak of anything so large as peace." The scholar followed him in, relieved, setting his satchel down by the door but keeping his 3 books tucked protectively under his arm, the way another man might keep hold of a sword or a child. The hermitage was small and dim and smelled of wood smoke and old paper, and the green smell of the river drifting in through the single window. The abbot filled a kettle from a clay jar and set it on the stove, and while it heated, he took down 2 cups from a shelf, one plain and empty, the other already half full of water gone cloudy and still, clearly poured some days before and never emptied. The scholar noticed the cloudy water in the second cup and thought, with the faint, private superiority of a man who notices such things, that perhaps the old abbot was not so very disciplined a housekeeper after all. He said nothing. He only set the cup down in front of himself when the abbot gestured for him to sit, the half-full cup of old, stale water still sitting there at his elbow. When the kettle began to sing, the abbot lifted it without hurry and walked first to the scholar's cup, the one already holding its cloudy water, and began, without comment, to pour the fresh hot tea directly into it. The water in the cup, already full, had nowhere to go. It rose, trembled at the rim, and spilled first in a thin trickle, then in a small flood over the side of the cup, across the low table, dripping onto the floor between the scholar's feet. The scholar startled backward, lifting his books out of the path of the spill, and made a small, surprised sound. "Teacher, the cup is overflowing," he said, as though this might not yet have been noticed. "Yes," the abbot agreed, and kept pouring, perfectly calm, until the kettle itself was empty. Only then did he set it down. The table between them was wet. The new tea had mixed, uselessly, with the old standing water, and most of it now sat in a thin sheet across the wood, soaking slowly into the grain. The scholar looked at the mess, then at the abbot, waiting for an explanation, an apology, anything. "You arrived here," the abbot said instead, settling back onto his cushion, "already full of sutras, full of commentaries on sutras, full of commentaries on commentaries, 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 commentaries. You are asking me to pour something new into you, and I am glad to pour it. The kettle is here, the tea is good. I would gladly give it to you all afternoon, but there is nowhere for it to go. There has been nowhere for it to go since before you arrived at my door." The scholar looked down at his own cup, not the one on the table, but the deeper cup he had carried up the mountain path inside himself, the one stacked floor to ceiling with notes and arguments and half-finished theories about peace. He thought of his desk back in the capital, papers in towers on every surface, no clear space even to set down a single empty bowl. "Then how," he said slowly, "does one make room?" The abbot did not answer this directly. He rarely answered anything directly. Instead, he reached over, without ceremony, and tipped the scholar's cup sideways, letting the last of the stale, mixed water run out onto the already wet table until the cup itself sat empty, gleaming faintly in the morning light from the window. "There," the abbot said. "Now it is a cup again, instead of a small flood waiting to happen." He set the kettle back over the stove to heat a second time. "We are in no hurry. The tea is not going anywhere." "Neither, I think, is your question." The scholar sat with his empty cup for a long while, saying nothing, watching the last bit of spilled water find its slow way toward the table's edge and drip, drop by drop, onto the packed earth floor. He noticed, almost without meaning to, that his shoulders had come down some small distance from where they usually sat, up near his ears. He noticed that he had stopped, for these few minutes at least, trying to recall the precise wording of the third commentary on the 7th sutra. He did not have an answer yet. But for the first time, in longer than he could remember, he was not full of an answer he didn't actually have. He was only simply an empty cup, sitting in a small room that smelled of wood smoke, waiting, without urgency, for whatever might come next to be poured. The kettle began, once more, to sing. There is another teaching that speaks to this same quiet truth, and it does not take place in any hermitage at all, but out in the open fields, under a wider sky. Once, in a river valley known for its rice, there lived a farmer named who worked harder than any other man in his village, and was known for it the way some men are known for their height or their voice. Through planting season and through harvest, Hugh was the first into the fields at first light and the last to leave at dark, and he had not, in 11 years, taken a single full day away from his land. One year, in the middle of the autumn harvest, when the rice stood heavy and golden and ready, and every able body in the village was bent over the stalks from dawn until the stars came out, who woke one morning and found that he simply could not rise from his sleeping mat. It was not illness, not exactly. His legs answered when he asked them to move, but something in him, something behind his eyes, something low in his chest refused, the way a tired ox will simply stop in the middle of the road, and no amount of the switch will move it another step. He lay there until the sun was well up, listening to his neighbors' voices already calling to one another across the fields, and the guilt of it pressed down on him like a stone laid flat across his ribs. He thought of the rice waiting. He thought of the other families who would see his empty field and wonder. By midday, ashamed of himself in a way he could not entirely name, he made his way down the village path to where the old hermit sometimes sat by the river, the one people went to when a trouble could not be explained simply. "I cannot make myself work today," Who confessed, the words coming out of him in a rush, as though confessing a theft. "The rice needs cutting. Everyone else is in the fields. And I am here instead, like this, useless to my own family." The hermit, who was old and small, and sat very still on a flat grey stone at the river's edge, did not look alarmed by this confession at all. He only gestured for Hugh to sit beside him, and for a long while neither man said anything. They simply watched the river move past, the way it had moved past that stone every day of Hugh's life, and every day before Hugh was born. "Tell me," the hermit said at last, "what do you imagine the field is doing right now while you sit here instead of in it?" Hugh considered this. "Standing there," he admitted, "waiting to be cut. Is it angry with you?" "The field can't be angry," Hugh said, a little impatiently. "It's a field, and yet you speak as though it is keeping some account against you," the hermit said mildly. "As though, somewhere, a tally is being kept of every hour you are not bent over it with your sickle, and the field itself will rise up and punish you for the missing hours." He nodded toward the gold stretch of rice visible from where they sat, swaying very slightly in the afternoon wind. "Look at it. Has it gone anywhere? Has a single stalk uprooted itself and walked off in protest because you did not come this morning?" Who looked, despite himself, and saw only what he expected to see: his rice, standing exactly where it had stood yesterday, neither closer to ruin nor further from it than it had been at dawn. "The field will still be there tomorrow," the hermit went on, "exactly as ready to be cut as it is today. It does not punish the farmer who rests one day in 11 years. It is not capable of punishing anyone. Only people do that to themselves, on the field's behalf, as though the field had asked them to." "But the harvest," Hugh started. "The harvest will be cut," the hermit said. "A day later than it might have been, by a man with strength still in his hands, rather than on time by a man who has quietly broken something inside himself that no amount of rice will repair afterward." He picked up a flat stone from beside him and turned it over once in his palm, considering it. "You have worked every day for 11 years. Today your body asked for one day back. This is not laziness announcing itself. This is a debt finally being collected, on terms you did not get to choose, because you never once offered to pay it voluntarily." Who sat with this for a long while, watching the river continue its long, unhurried argument with the stones beneath it, wearing them down so slowly that no single day's water could ever take credit for the work. He thought of his rice, standing patient under the autumn sun, asking nothing of him at all beyond what he was actually able to give. He did not return to the fields that day. He sat instead by the river until the light went gold, then grey, then soft and blue. And when he walked home in the dusk, his neighbour's fields all freshly cut and his own still standing, he found that the guilt, while not entirely gone, had grown quieter small enough, now, to sit beside, rather than to carry on his back like a second harvest he had never agreed to bring in. The next morning, he rose before dawn, as he always had, and went out to his field and found it exactly where he had left it, exactly as ready, asking nothing of him except the work itself, freely given, rather than work paid out under the lash of a debt that had never actually existed anywhere except inside his own tired and faithful chest. There is a smaller teaching, too, light as a single leaf, that belongs here as well, and it comes from the mouth of a child rather than a farmer. In a village at the foot of a forested mountain, there lived a small boy named Wen, who was, by his own estimation, an unusually serious thinker for his 7 years. He had noticed something that troubled him, and one afternoon he brought this trouble directly to his grandmother, who was shelling peas on the porch in the slow gold light of late afternoon. "Grandmother," he said, settling himself on the step beside her, "why do the monks at the mountain temple get fed by the whole village and given new robes every winter and bowed to by everyone who passes, when all they do all day is sit very still and not do anything at all?" His grandmother did not look up from her peas right away. She let the question sit in the warm air for a moment, the way she let dough sit before working it again. "What makes you so certain they are not doing anything?" she asked finally. "I've watched them," Wen said, with the confidence of a boy who has, in fact, watched them more than once from the edge of the temple courtyard. "They sit, sometimes, for hours. Nothing happens. No rice grows because of it. No roof gets built because of it. My father builds roofs all day and nobody bows to him." His grandmother set down her bowl of peas and looked out at the mountain, where the temple roof was just visible above the tree line, a small, dark wing against the sky. "Tell me, when you go to the well for water," she said, "do you ever notice that the water itself is still, even while everything else in the village is moving, the carts, the chickens, your father's hammer, your own 2 feet running everywhere at once?" "I suppose," Wen said, not quite seeing where this was going. "And have you ever noticed that on the days you go to that still water and sit beside it for a while, just looking at it, just listening to nothing in particular, you come home a little less like a small storm and a little more like yourself again?" Wen thought about this. There had been days like that. Days when the noise in his head about a friend's unkindness, or a scolding he'd received, or a fear he couldn't quite name, had seemed to settle simply from sitting near the well's quiet water for a while, without doing anything to it at all. "The monks," his grandmother said, "are the village's still water. They do not grow the rice. They do not build the roofs. But when a farmer's wife loses a child, or a soldier comes home from somewhere terrible and cannot speak of it, or your own father one day grows so tired he forgets why he is building anything at all, where do you imagine they go to remember?" The temple," Wen admitted. "Not because the monks will tell them what to do," she said, "but because the monks have made themselves into a kind of stillness a person can sit beside, the way you sit beside the well. That is not nothing, little one. That may, in fact, be one of the hardest and most valuable things a person can learn, to become simply still enough, simply empty enough of their own noise, that other people's noise has somewhere quiet to settle for a while." Wen looked up toward the temple roof again, and for the first time, it did not look to him like a place where nothing happened. It looked, instead, like a kind of, a deep, quiet place the whole village could draw from, even though nothing visible was ever drawn out of it at all. "So resting," he said slowly, working it out, "is itself a kind of work. Just a different kind than father's. His grandmother smiled and picked her peas back up. "Perhaps," she said, which was the only kind of answer she ever liked to give, a question that large. Or perhaps it is not work at all, and that is exactly the gift of it, that something so without effort can still be worth so much to the people around it. Not everything valuable has to come from strain, my serious little grandson. Sometimes the most valuable thing in the whole village is simply a place that has stopped straining, so everyone else has somewhere to remember how. There is a teaching, too, that does not need any human voice at all to carry it. Only a tree, standing through the cold months, doing what looks, from a distance, exactly like nothing. In the hills above the same river valley, on the eastern slope where the wind came down hardest in winter, there grew an old plum tree that the local children believed, every year around the same time, had finally died. It happened every January. The leaves, having gone first yellow and then a deep, tired brown, would finally let go entirely, and the tree would stand through the coldest months as nothing more than a dark architecture of bare branches against a colorless sky. No green anywhere on it, no sign of sap, no birds bothering to land in branches that offered no fruit and no shade and apparently no life. One winter, a young apprentice named Tao, newly arrived to study under the abbot of the river Hermitage, walked past this tree every morning on his way to draw water, and every morning he felt a small, specific sadness about it. He had grown fond of the tree the autumn before, when it had still been heavy with fruit and humming faintly with bees, and now it looked to him like a thing that had simply given up, gone hollow, gone quiet, offering nothing to anyone, taking up space at the edge of the path for no purpose he could discern. One particularly bitter morning, with frost still silvering the bare branches, Tao mentioned this sadness to the abbot as they walked together toward the river. "It troubles me to see it like that," Tao admitted. "All winter, just standing there, doing nothing. It used to be so alive. Now it looks finished." The abbot stopped walking and looked up at the tree for a long moment, the way a man looks at an old friend he has not seen in some time but recognizes instantly anyway. "Tell me," he said, "where do you imagine the tree has gone?" "Nowhere," Tao said. "It's right there. It just looks dead. And yet in 3 months," the abbot said, "this same tree, which you are quite certain has given up, will be the very first thing in this whole valley to bloom, before the grass greens, before a single other tree on this slope dares put out so much as a bud. This exact tree, the one that looks finished to you right now, will be the first sign of spring the entire village sees." Tao frowned at the bare branches, trying to reconcile this with what his eyes were telling him. How can something that looks so empty be preparing to be first at anything? "Because what you are seeing is not emptiness," the abbot said. "It is concentration. All winter, while the leaves are gone and the branches stand bare, and you walk past feeling sorry for it, the tree is doing an enormous amount of quiet work, exactly where you cannot see it down in the dark, under the frozen ground, in the roots. It has not stopped living. It has simply stopped spending its life where anyone can watch. It has pulled all its strength down and inward, gathering everything it has, so that when the proper moment comes, it can put out blossoms faster and fuller than any tree that kept trying to perform liveliness all winter long. Exhausting itself with green leaves, it could not actually afford to keep feeding in the cold." They walked on a little farther before the abbot spoke again. "You make the same mistake about the tree," he said, "that you sometimes make about yourself. When you sit in meditation and your mind goes quiet, when you take an afternoon away from your studies and simply lie in the grass doing what looks, from the outside, like nothing, some part of you grows uneasy, doesn't it? Some part of you suspects you have gone dead or lazy or finished. You measure your own worth by visible green leaves, the way you measure the trees." Tao said nothing because it was true, and the abbot had a way of saying true things that did not require defending against. "But rest," the abbot continued, "real rest, is never the opposite of life. It is one of life's most essential and most secret forms of labor, the labor of gathering rather than spending. The root does not feel guilty for resting through the winter. It does not lie awake underground, worrying that the other trees on the slope are getting ahead of it by keeping a few sad leaves on through January. It trusts the order of things. It does its dark, unglamorous work exactly when the work needs doing. And when spring finally turns the corner, it lets go of all that gathered strength in a single generous burst, and is the very first thing anyone sees. They had reached the river by now, and the abbot crouched down at the bank, breaking the thin skin of morning ice with one finger so the water beneath could move freely again. "When you next feel guilty for resting," he said, not looking up, "ask yourself whether you have actually stopped living the way the tree appears to have stopped living, or whether you have simply, wisely, stopped performing liveliness on the surface so that something deeper in you can gather what it needs, in the dark, for a blooming you cannot yet see and do not need to rush." Tao looked back over his shoulder at the bare plum tree, standing patient and dark against the pale winter sky, and for the first time all season, he did not feel sorry for it. He felt, instead, something closer to respect, the particular respect owed to a thing that knows exactly how to wait. That spring, when the tree did bloom first, exactly as the abbot had said it would, bursting almost overnight into a soft explosion of pale pink against bare grey branches, while every other tree on the slope was still only just beginning to bud, Tao stood beneath it for a long while, saying nothing, simply watching the bees return to work it had not rushed. On a timetable it had never once apologized for keeping to itself. There is a related teaching, this one carried not by a tree but by a question, asked by a young monk who could not stop feeling, every single morning, that he was somehow cheating. In a mountain monastery, some distance from the river Hermitage, there lived a young monk named Jian, who had taken to meditation with real sincerity, rising before dawn each day to sit cross-legged on his small cushion in the cold, half-dark hall, just as he had been instructed. And yet, almost every morning, somewhere in the long stretch of stillness, a familiar discomfort would rise up in him that had nothing to do with his legs or his back, and everything to do with a quiet, nagging accusation he could not seem to silence, that he was being lazy. That somewhere outside the hall, the other monks were sweeping the courtyard, or tending the vegetable garden, or carrying water up from the well, doing visible, useful things with their bodies and their hours, while he sat here, eyes half closed, apparently producing nothing at all. One morning, after sitting had ended and the others had filed out to their various chores, Jian remained behind, troubled enough that he finally brought the question to the old teacher, who oversaw the monastery's practice, a small, white-haired man, everyone simply called Old Teacher Wei, who had been sitting on that same cushion, by all accounts, since before Jian's own mother was born. "Teacher," Jian said, kneeling before him, "I must confess something. Every morning during sitting, I feel as though I am stealing time. The others are working. I am only sitting here, doing nothing, and I cannot make the guilt of it go away, no matter how still I try to become." Old Teacher Wei considered this for a while, his eyes closed, in the particular way that made it hard to tell whether he was thinking deeply or simply resting. Finally, he opened his eyes and asked, "Tell me, Jian, last night, while you slept, did your heart continue beating?" Jian blinked, caught off guard by the question. "Of course," he said. "I would not have woken otherwise." "And did you at any point in the night issue an order to it? Did you lie there in your sleep and consciously instruct your heart, beat now and now and now, again, the way you might instruct your hand to lift a bucket?" "No," Jian admitted. "It simply beats on its own." "And do you feel guilty?" Old Teacher Wei asked. "Lying there asleep all night, doing nothing at all to make your own heart continue its work? Do you wake in the morning ashamed that you let it beat 80 times a minute, all night long, without once supervising it, without once feeling you had earned the privilege of being kept alive while you slept. Jian almost laughed at the strangeness of the question, but stopped himself, sensing that the old teacher was not joking. "No," he said slowly. "It never occurs to me to feel guilty about that. It simply happens. It would happen whether I felt guilty about it or not. And yet you feel guilty," old teacher Wei said, "about the stillness of your sitting, which is doing very much the same kind of work, only somewhere a little less hidden than your heart. While you sit, do you imagine that nothing at all is happening, simply because nothing is visible to a passing eye?" I'm not certain anymore," Jian said. "Your sweeping companions," the old teacher went on, "are tending the outer courtyard. Useful work, necessary work, work I am glad they do. But you, sitting on your cushion in the cold half-light, attending something else, the inner courtyard, the one nobody else can see into, the one that fills, day after day, with old fears and old griefs and old unfinished arguments with people who are not even in the room. If that inner courtyard is never swept, Jian, it grows so cluttered that eventually a person can no longer move through their own life without tripping over what is piled up inside them. Your sitting is not the absence of work. It is the only work that happens to take place somewhere your eyes cannot follow, the same way your heartbeat takes place somewhere your eyes cannot follow, and is no less real, no less necessary, no less earned simply because no one can watch you do it." Jian sat with this for a long moment, feeling something in his chest loosen very slightly, the way a knot loosens not all at once but by one strand quietly giving way before the others. "So I do not need to apologize," he said slowly, "for work no one can see me doing. You do not even need to call it work if the word troubles you," old teacher Wei said, with the faintest trace of a smile. "Call it tending, call it the heart's other, quieter heartbeat. Whatever you call it, you were never stealing those hours, Jian. You were only doing, in stillness, the one kind of labor that happens to leave no dust on the floor for anyone else to admire afterward." From that morning on, Jian still sat each day before dawn on his small cold cushion, and the old guilty voice did not vanish all at once. Old voices rarely do, but it grew quieter, month over month, the way a bell grows quieter the longer it has already been ringing, until at last what remained beneath it was something closer to trust, the simple, settled trust that his heart had been keeping its own counsel all along, beating on, asking no one's permission, owing no one an explanation, and that his stillness, in its own way, had been allowed to do exactly the same. There is a teaching about a water carrier too, which speaks not to guilt exactly, but to something just beneath it, the quiet fear that if a person stops moving even for a moment, everything they are responsible for will spill. In a village some distance up the same river valley, where the well sat at the very bottom of a long, steep hill, that there lived a young man named Bo, who had been given the task of carrying water from the well to his family's house, twice a day, every day, for as long as he had been strong enough to lift a full bucket. As he grew older and his family grew larger, the task grew with him. 2 buckets became 4, then 8, carried on a long wooden yoke across his shoulders, up and down the same steep hill, morning and evening. Without a single day's pause that he could remember, Bo had become, over the years, very fast. He believed with some pride that speed was the secret to his success. The faster he climbed the hill, the less time the water had to slosh and spill, the more of it arrived intact at his family's door. So he had trained himself never to slow down, never to set the yoke aside even for a moment's rest, never to pause and stretch his aching shoulders partway up the slope, for fear that the moment's hesitation would somehow cost him water he could not afford to lose. But lately, something strange had begun happening. The faster and more constantly Bo carried his buckets, the more water he seemed to lose along the way. His arms, never given a single moment's true rest, had begun to tremble faintly with the effort not enough to notice at first, but enough, over the long climb, to set the water rocking inside the buckets in small, relentless waves that grew larger the longer he pushed himself onward without pause. By the time he reached the top of the hill each evening, his buckets were noticeably lighter than when he'd filled them, and his shoulders ached in a way that no longer eased overnight, the way it once had. One evening, exhausted and frustrated by yet another half-empty bucket, Bo set his yoke down at the edge of the village square, more out of defeated collapse than any real decision to rest, and happened to find himself sitting near an old beggar who often sat there at dusk, watching the village settle into evening. "You move like a man being chased," the old beggar observed, not unkindly, watching Bo rub his trembling arms. "I have to move fast," Bo said. "If I slow down, I lose time. If I lose time, my family goes without water that much longer." "And yet," the old beggar said, nodding toward Bo's buckets, where the water had not fully settled even now, long minutes after he'd stopped walking, "it looks to me as though you are losing far more water to your hurry than you would ever lose to a moment's rest." Bo looked down at his buckets, irritated by the observation but unable to deny it. The water was still faintly trembling, rocking gently against the wooden sides, far more agitated than it would have been if he had simply walked at an ordinary pace. "Tell me," the beggar said, "what happens to a full bucket of water when the arm carrying it begins to shake?" "It spills," Bo admitted, "more than if the arm were steady. And what makes an arm begin to shake, more than anything else?" Bo considered this. "Tiredness," he said slowly. "An arm that has not been allowed to rest, that has been asked to carry weight for too long without setting it down even once." "So your hurry," the old beggar said, "the very thing you believed was saving you water, has instead been the thing costing you the most water of all, not because hurry itself is wrong, but because an arm pushed past its true strength trembles, and a trembling arm spills. And so the very thing you feared arriving with less water than you started with, you have brought entirely upon yourself, by refusing to ever set the yoke down long enough to let your arms recover their steadiness." Bo sat with this, watching the last of the day's light fade gold, and then grey across the rooftops of the village. "If I rest along the way," he said slowly, working it through, "I lose time on the path. But I arrive with steadier arms, and the water travels straighter and spills less." "And which matters more to your family?" the old beggar asked. "The minute you saved by never once setting your burden down, or the cups of water that minute cost you along the way?" The next morning, Bo did something he had never once permitted himself to do in all his years of carrying water. Partway up the long hill, with his shoulders just beginning to ache and his arms just beginning their first faint tremble, he stopped. He set the yoke down gently in the shade of a roadside tree, stretched his arms out wide for a few long breaths, and let his shoulders simply hang loose and unburdened for the length of perhaps 30 breaths, no more. Then he lifted the yoke again and continued up the hill. He arrived that evening with more water in his buckets than he had carried home in longer than he could remember, not because he had moved any faster, but because his arms, given those few honest minutes of rest along the way, had carried their burden steadier the whole rest of the distance. The short pause had cost him almost nothing in time. It had given back, in steadiness, far more than it took. In the weeks that followed, Bo built small, brief rests into every journey up the hill, never long enough to feel like idleness, only long enough to let his arms remember what it felt like not to shake. And his family, without ever knowing exactly why, began to notice that their water jars at home were fuller in the evenings than they had been in years, simply because the man carrying the water had finally stopped believing that the only way to arrive with enough was to never once, along the way, allow himself to rest. There is another teaching, gentler still, about a woman who had spent her whole life so full of other people's needs that she had nearly forgotten her own stillness existed at all, until, very late, she was finally given the chance to remember. In a small house at the edge of a rice village, there lived an old woman named May, who had, by the time this story finds her, spent some 60 years of her life caring for others without any real pause between one need and the next. She had raised 5 children and then helped raise several of their children in turn, and had nursed an ailing husband through a long final illness, and had, in the years after his passing, simply continued caring for whoever in the wider family next needed caring, for a daughter-in-law recovering from childbirth, a grandson failing his exams and needing comfort, a neighbor's sick mother with no one else nearby to sit with her through the long nights. When at last, in her 73rd year, her family gently insisted that she allow herself to simply rest for a while, her grandchildren now grown, her daughters capable and nearby, nothing left that truly required her hands, May discovered something she had not expected at all. Left alone in her quiet house for the first time in longer than she could remember, with no one's needs immediately pressing on her, she found that the silence did not feel peaceful. It felt, instead, enormous and strange and faintly frightening, the way an empty room feels larger and colder than the same room ever did when it was full. She went, somewhat embarrassed by her own unease, to the small temple at the edge of the village, where an old nun she had known for many years sat most afternoons in the quiet courtyard. "I do not understand myself," May confessed, sitting down heavily on the stone bench beside the nun. "My whole life I longed for a moment's peace. Now I have been given an entire empty afternoon, with nothing and no one requiring anything of me, and instead of peace, I feel only a strange kind of panic, as though I have forgotten how to simply exist without being needed by someone." The old nun did not offer any quick comfort or explanation. She only patted the bench beside her and said, "Sit with me a while then. We do not have to talk about it. We do not have to talk about anything at all." And so they sat together, the 2 old women, in the slanting afternoon light of the temple courtyard, saying nothing for a very long time. At first, May found the silence almost unbearable. Her hands kept wanting some task to occupy them. Her mind kept reaching for some worry to attend to, the way a person who has stood for 60 years keeps swaying slightly, even after finally being allowed to sit. But the nun beside her did not fill the silence with words, and did not seem at all troubled by May's restlessness. And slowly, without any particular moment where it happened, May's hands grew still in her lap, and her breathing grew longer, and the strange panic loosened its grip by some small fraction. "You are not used to existing for your own sake," the nun said eventually, very gently, when the light had begun to soften toward evening. "For 60 years, your worth was measured in what you gave to others. That is a beautiful way to have spent a life, May. But it has left you believing, somewhere very deep down, that an empty hour with no one to tend is an hour with no purpose in it at all, almost a kind of failure. Is it not?" May asked, and the question came out smaller than she intended. "Tell me," the nun said, "when the moon rises over that courtyard wall tonight, will it cease to be the moon, simply because no one happens to be looking up to admire it?" May considered this. "No," she said slowly, "it would still be the moon. You are the same," the nun said. "You did not become worth something only on the days you cared for someone else. You were always worth something, simply by being here the way the moon is always the moon, whether or not anyone below is watching. The caring you gave so generously for 60 years was a gift you chose to offer outward. It was never the source of your worth to begin with. It only ever looked that way because you gave it so constantly that you never had a quiet hour in which to notice the difference." They sat together a while longer, until the courtyard fell into shadow and the first faint stars appeared above the temple wall, and May found, to her own quiet surprise, that the silence had stopped feeling like an emptiness she had to justify, and had begun, instead, to feel almost like company, a stillness she did not have to fill with anything at all in order for it to be enough, simply because she herself sitting inside it, breathing it in and out, had always already been enough. She returned to that quiet temple bench many afternoons after that, not because anyone needed her there, and not because the silence had become easy all at once, it never entirely did, but because, little by little, she was learning the last and perhaps hardest lesson of an entire long life spent giving. That, resting, doing nothing at all, simply existing without producing or tending or fixing a single thing, was not a betrayal of the woman she had always been. It was, instead, a kind of homecoming to a version of herself that had been waiting, very patiently, the whole time. There is a small teaching now, carried not by any person at all, but by an old bronze bell that hung at the edge of the river Hermitage, which the abbot rang each evening at dusk, and which, in its own quiet way, understood something about rest that took the young apprentice Tao a long while to learn. The bell hung from a simple wooden frame just outside the hermitage door, suspended on a length of braided rope so that it could swing freely in any direction, never quite touching the post beside it. Every evening, just as the light began to fail, the abbot would strike it once with a small wooden mallet, and its tone would roll out over the river and the rice fields and the darkening hills, clear and round and long, fading slowly into the evening air until it was impossible to say exactly when the sound had finally stopped and the ordinary silence had resumed. Tao had grown fond of this evening sound, and one dusk, curious, he asked the abbot a question that had been sitting in him for some weeks. "Why does the bell hang so loosely?" he asked. "Wouldn't it ring more reliably if it were fixed firmly to the post, so it never swung about and risked knocking against anything?" The abbot considered the question with the same unhurried attention he gave most questions. "Try it," he said simply, and handed Tao the mallet. Tao struck the bell as he always had, and it gave its long, clear tone, swinging gently on its rope, the sound rolling out exactly as it always did. "Now," the abbot said, "press your palm flat against the bronze, right where it touches the post, and hold it there firmly, so it cannot swing freely at all. Then strike it again." Tao did as he was told, bracing the bell against the post with one hand, and struck it again with the mallet. The sound that came out this time was nothing like before, a dull, flat clunk, short and lifeless, swallowed almost as soon as it began, with none of the long, resonant tone that usually rolled out over the valley. "The bell can only sing," the abbot said, "when it is free to hang, untouched by the post, allowed to move on its own rope without being braced or steadied or held in place by anything. The moment it touches something solid, the moment it is pinned down and prevented from its natural swing, its voice dies in its own throat." Tao looked at the bell, now hanging still and silent again, its earlier clear tone already long faded into the evening air. "You are like this bell," the abbot continued, "more often than you know. When you allow yourself to hang loose for a while, unscheduled, unproductive, simply swinging gently with no fixed task, pressing against you, something in you is finally free to resonate the way it was built to. But the moment you pin yourself constantly against some post of obligation, some endless task you refuse to ever set down even for an evening, your own voice goes flat and short, the way the bells did just now. Not because you have become a worse person, only because you have stopped allowing yourself the one condition under which your fuller sound was always able to ring out." He took the mallet back from Tao's hand and struck the bell once more, letting it swing freely on its rope, and the long, clear tone rolled out again over the darkening river, exactly as it had every evening before, fading so slowly into the dusk that neither of them could quite say, by the end, whether the sound had stopped or simply become too soft for the ear to follow any further, dissolving into the same wide and patient silence that had been there all along, waiting underneath it. There is a longer teaching still, about a wealthy merchant who had built a fortune so large it should, by any reasonable accounting, have brought him a great deal of peace, and yet had instead brought him almost none at all. In a busy river town downstream from the hermitage, there lived a merchant named Liang, who had begun his working life with nothing but a single cart and a strong back, and had, over 30 years of relentless effort, built himself into the wealthiest trader for 3 counties in any direction. He owned warehouses along the river docks, fleets of barges carrying silk and grain and porcelain, and a household large enough that he had long since lost an exact count of how many people depended, in one way or another, on his continued success. And yet Liang had not had a single full night's untroubled sleep in nearly a decade. Each night, lying in his large and comfortable bed, he found his mind running the same anxious circuit it had run the night before, and the night before that calculating which rival trader might be gaining ground while he slept, which shipment might be delayed, which competitor in a neighboring town might, at this very hour, be striking a deal that would leave Liang's own fortunes one step further behind. The richer he grew, the more he seemed to have to lose, and the more he had to lose, the less he found himself able to simply close his eyes and let the night pass without supervision. One autumn, suffering from an exhaustion that had begun to show plainly on his face and trouble even his closest household staff, Liang traveled upriver to consult the old abbot at the river hermitage, having heard, as many troubled travelers eventually did, that the old man there sometimes had a way of loosening knots that no physician's medicine could touch. "I cannot rest," Liang told the abbot, sitting heavily on the low bench outside the hermitage door, his fine silk robes looking strangely out of place against the simple wooden frame of the building. "Every night I think if I rest now even for a single night, some rival will use the time to overtake me. Everything I have built took 30 years of never once looking away. I am afraid that the moment I do, all of it begins, quietly, to slip." The abbot listened without interrupting, then gestured toward the river, running past just below the hermitage, swollen now with autumn rain, moving fast and brown and full toward the distant sea. "Tell me," he said, "does that river appear to be straining toward the sea? Does it look, to your eye, as though it fears some other, faster river might reach the ocean first, and so it must thrash and hurry, and never once pause to rest along its banks, lest it be overtaken?" Liang watched the water for a moment. "No," he admitted. "It only flows, and yet it will reach the sea," the abbot said. "Every drop of it, eventually, without exception, whether it hurries or not, whether it strains against its banks or simply allows the land's own slope to carry it forward at whatever pace the land provides. The river does not need to try to be the fastest river. It only needs to keep being a river, and the sea takes care of the rest, in its own time, exactly as it always has." "But I am not a river," Liang said. "I have rivals, other merchants, who would gladly take my place at the docks if I slowed down, even slightly." "Perhaps," the abbot said. "And yet consider, in 30 years of never once looking away, has your relentless vigilance actually prevented every misfortune that could possibly have befallen your fortune? Or have setbacks come anyway, now and again, exactly as they come to every merchant who has ever lived, vigilant or not, simply because that is the nature of fortune, rising and falling according to laws far larger than any single man's wakefulness?" Liang considered this honestly, and found, somewhat to his own discomfort, that it was true. Despite a decade of sleepless vigilance, there had still been a bad harvest 2 years past that cost him dearly, still been a rival's clever maneuver, last spring, that he had not managed to foresee no matter how little he slept. His exhausted watchfulness, it seemed, had not actually purchased him the safety he believed it was buying. It had only purchased him exhaustion. The river does not refuse to flow at night simply because it cannot see the sea from where it currently runs, the abbot said. It trusts the slope of the land to carry it forward even while the moon is the only witness. Perhaps your fortune, too, has its own slope built over 30 years of real skill and real effort that does not actually require your sleepless supervision every single night, in order to continue carrying you forward. Perhaps the work you already did for 30 years was the real river, and what keeps you awake now is not protecting that river at all. It is only fear, dressed up to look like diligence, costing you far more in worn nerves and shortened years than it has ever once given back to you in safety. Liang returned home troubled by this conversation, in a way that took several weeks to settle into something useful. But slowly, he began experimenting with small acts of trust that he had not permitted himself in a decade. An evening spent simply walking along the docks, watching the river rather than reviewing his ledgers. A night here and there where he allowed himself to actually sleep through till morning instead of lying awake calculating. His fortune, to his great and quiet surprise, did not collapse in his absence. The river continued flowing toward the sea exactly as it always had, with or without his sleepless witness. And slowly, Liang began to suspect that it always would have, however little peace he had allowed himself along the way. There is one more teaching that belongs in this same gentle company, smaller than the others, almost weightless, like a single petal settling onto still water. In the hills not far from the hermitage, there was a narrow footpath that ran along the ridge above the village, worn smooth over many generations by the feet of farmers, carrying baskets to market, and children chasing one another home before dark. For years, a young traveling soldier named Shen had passed this way often, always at a half-run, always glancing over his shoulder, never once pausing to notice the path itself, only the destination at its far end. One evening, returning home after a long campaign that had finally ended, Shen found himself walking that same ridge path at a far slower pace than he had ever walked it before, partly from a wound in his leg that had not fully healed, and partly from an exhaustion that had settled somewhere deeper than his muscles. For the first time in years, he was not hurrying toward anything. And as he walked, slow and limping, he noticed something that startled him. The path itself was beautiful. Wildflowers grew thick along its edges, blue and white and small. The ridge offered a view of the whole valley below, the river catching the last of the evening light that he had apparently walked past 100 times before without once seeing it. He stopped at the path's highest point and sat down on a flat stone, simply to rest his leg, and an old woman gathering firewood nearby smiled at him and said, "You're seeing it now, aren't you?" "Seeing what?" Shen asked. "The path," she said. "It's been here, exactly like this, every single time you've ever walked it. The flowers, the view of the river, none of it appeared today, especially for you. It was always here, waiting. You were simply never walking slowly enough before now to notice that it had been waiting at all." Shen looked out over the valley for a long while, the evening light turning the river to soft gold below him, and understood, without quite being able to put it into words yet, that something in him had spent years rushing toward a destination that kept moving further away the harder he ran toward it, and that the only time the path had ever actually given him anything, it had been on an evening when his wounded leg had finally forced him to stop outrunning it. There is a teaching now about a widow, which moves a little more slowly than the others, the way grief itself moves more slowly than ordinary tiredness, and asks to be told gently. In a fishing village, at the mouth of the same river, where it finally widened and slowed before giving itself over to the sea, there lived a woman named Ling, whose husband had died the previous winter after a long illness that she had nursed him through, day and night, for the better part of 2 years. In all that time, she had not once stopped moving, boiling medicines, changing linens, sitting up through fevered nights, managing the small fish salting business they had built together so that it would still be standing when, as she had believed almost until the very end, he recovered. He had not recovered. And in the months since his death, Ling had found that she still could not stop moving, even though there was, in truth, far less now that strictly needed doing. She rose before dawn out of habit and scrubbed floors that were already clean. She mended nets that did not need mending. She visited neighbors to ask if they needed help with anything at all, anything, simply so that her hands would have something to occupy them, other than the stillness she could not bear to sit inside. One afternoon, exhausted in a way sleep no longer seemed to touch, she came to the small shrine at the edge of the village, where an old monk who traveled between several river towns happened, that particular week, to be staying. She found him sitting quietly beneath the shrine's single old willow tree, and she sat down nearby, not entirely intending to speak, but finding the words coming out of her anyway. "I do not know how to stop," she confessed. "Everyone tells me to rest, to grieve properly, to sit with my sorrow instead of running from it. But the moment I am still, even for a moment, it rises up in me like floodwater, and I am afraid that if I let it rise all the way, I will drown in it and never come back up." The old monk did not offer comfort right away. He let her words settle into the quiet beneath the willow tree for a long moment before he spoke. "Tell me about this river," he said instead, nodding toward the water, moving slowly past the village toward the sea. "In the spring, when the snow melts in the mountains, does it flood?" "Every year," Ling said. "It rises over its banks, sometimes quite high." "And does the village drown every single year when this happens?" "No," she said. "The water rises, and then, after some days, it goes back down again. It always has." "Why do you imagine that is?" the monk asked. "Why does the flood not simply keep rising forever, swallowing the whole village whole?" Ling considered this. "Because there's only so much snow," she said slowly. "Once it's all melted and run down from the mountains, there's nothing left to feed the flood. It has to recede, eventually. It can't keep rising past what fed it in the first place. Your grief," the old monk said gently, "is the same kind of flood. It feels, right now, as though it might rise forever, as though if you stop moving long enough to let it in, it will simply keep climbing until it covers everything you are. But grief, like snowmelt, is not infinite. It has an amount to it, however large that amount may currently feel. If you allow it to rise when it needs to rise, it will, in its own time, recede again, not because you fought it down, but because, like all floods, it eventually runs out of what was feeding it, and the water finds its own way back toward the sea." "And if I keep running instead?" Ling asked. "If I never let it rise at all?" "Then it does not go away," the monk said. "It only waits, somewhere underground, the way floodwater seeps down into low ground and sits there, unable to drain properly, slowly souring whatever it touches. The villages that suffer worst from flooding, in my experience, are rarely the ones that let the river rise freely over its natural banks each spring. They are the ones that built walls in all the wrong places, trying to prevent any rising at all, only to have the water find some other way in eventually, all at once, with far less warning and far more damage than if they had simply let the river do, in its own season, what rivers have always done." Ling sat with this for a long while beneath the old willow tree, watching its long branches trail in the slow current at the riverbank, swaying gently with each small movement of the water, without ever once resisting it. "I am afraid," she admitted finally, very quietly, "that if I stop and let myself feel how much I have lost, I will not be able to keep being myself afterward. That grieving properly will somehow end me. You will not be the same afterward," the monk agreed, with a gentleness that did not flinch from the truth of it. "But you are not the same now either, compared to who you were before he became ill. Grief does not return you to where you started. It carries you somewhere new, the way floodwater carries silt downriver and leaves it somewhere it was never before, richer for the leaving than the ground was previously. You will not drown in this, Ling. You will be changed by it, the way every riverbank is changed by every flood it has ever survived. But the village is still there, every single spring, exactly as it was the year before, only slightly more shaped by the water that has passed through it. So will you be." In the months that followed, Ling slowly allowed herself to stop scrubbing already clean floors quite so often, and to sit, instead, by the river some evenings, simply letting the grief rise when it needed to rise, trusting a little more each time that it would also, eventually, recede, not because she had defeated it, but because, like all true floods, it was never going to rise forever in the first place. There is one more teaching from this same gentle company, this one carried by a soldier who had come home from a war that had asked more of him than any single body should reasonably be asked to give, and who had not, in all the months since his return, allowed himself a single day's true stillness. In a village some distance from the river, there lived a man named Feng, who had returned home the previous autumn from 3 long years at the frontier, where he had served as a foot soldier in conflicts that he rarely spoke of, even to his own family. He had come home physically whole, by most measures no missing limb, no visible wound that had not long since closed over, and yet something in him moved differently now, watchfully, as though his body had not yet been told that the war was actually over. He had thrown himself, since returning, into rebuilding his family's small farm with an intensity that worried his elderly mother more than it reassured her. He worked from the moment the sky greyed each morning until well after dark, refusing every suggestion that he slow down, refusing even a single afternoon's rest on market days, when the rest of the village gathered to talk and trade and simply be together for an hour. One evening, his mother, watching him collapse onto his sleeping mat with the particular rigid exhaustion of a man who has worked himself past the point of any real relief, finally asked him directly why he could not allow himself even a single hour of true rest. "If I stop moving," Feng admitted, the words coming out of him more honestly than he had intended, in the safety of the dark room, "I am afraid of what will catch up to me. There were things at the frontier, things I saw, things I did, things that happened to men beside me that I have not had to look at directly, because I have never once stopped long enough to let them catch up. If I am always working, always tired enough to fall asleep the instant I lie down, I never have to lie awake with what is actually behind me." His mother said nothing for a long while, simply sitting with him in the dark. "There is an old story," she said eventually, "about a traveler being chased by his own shadow, who runs faster and faster all day, trying to outpace it, until he collapses from exhaustion at dusk, only to discover, lying there too tired to run any further, that his shadow has simply lain down quietly beside him, the moment the sun began to set, exactly as it always would have, with no chasing required at all. The shadow was never actually trying to catch him. It was only ever doing what shadows do, which is follow, patiently, at whatever pace the person ahead of it sets, neither faster nor slower." Feng said nothing, but he was listening. "What you carry from the frontier is your shadow now, Feng," she said. "I do not believe it is trying to destroy you by catching up. I believe it is only waiting for you to finally slow down enough that it can lie down quietly beside you, the way every shadow eventually does at dusk, so that the two of you can simply rest together, instead of you spending every waking hour running from something that was never actually chasing you with any cruelty at all, only following, the way grief and memory always follow, patiently, until we finally stop long enough to let them settle." Feng did not change all at once. Old fears built over 3 years of frontier nights do not dissolve in a single conversation. But in the weeks that followed, he allowed himself, very gradually, small, still moments he had been refusing himself since his return, an hour at the market with his neighbors, an evening sitting outside, simply watching the light change over the fields without working through it. The memories did, in those quieter hours, sometimes rise up, exactly as he had feared. But they did not destroy him the way he had believed they might. They only sat beside him for a while, the way an old shadow settles at dusk, asking nothing more than to finally be acknowledged, before, in their own slow time, growing quieter still, There is a teaching, too, that came to the river hermitage, not through any seeker who walked deliberately up the path, but through someone who simply happened to be passing, the way certain teachings arrive sideways, almost by accident. One late afternoon, a traveling potter stopped at the hermitage to ask directions to the village market, having lost his way somewhere along the river road. He carried with him a basket of his wares, wrapped carefully in straw, and as he set the basket down to rest his arms, while the abbot pointed out the correct path, one small bowl shifted loose from its wrapping and struck the stone step, cracking neatly across its base. The potter's face fell at once. "That was to be my finest piece for the market," he said, lifting the cracked bowl with visible disappointment. "Now it's ruined. No one pays good money for a broken bowl." The abbot took the bowl gently from the potter's hands and turned it over, examining the crack clean, straight, not shattered, simply split in one honest line across its base. "May I keep this one?" the abbot asked, "and give you a few coins toward your loss, so you are not traveling onward with nothing for your trouble?" The potter, puzzled but not about to refuse a fair trade, agreed and continued on his way toward the market with his remaining, unbroken wares, leaving the cracked bowl behind on the hermitage step. That evening, the abbot set the bowl on his small work table and, with great patience over the following days, repaired the crack using a fine paste mixed with gold dust, so that when the work was finished, the bowl no longer hid its break at all. Instead, a thin, bright seam of gold ran across its base where the crack had been, catching the light each time the bowl was lifted, visible and unashamed. Tao, watching this slow repair take shape over several evenings, finally asked why the abbot had bothered mending a bowl that anyone else would simply have thrown away. "Because it is more beautiful now," the abbot said simply, holding it up so the gold seam caught the last of the evening light through the window than it ever was before it broke. Tao frowned, not quite following. How can a crack make something more beautiful? Surely an unbroken bowl is the better bowl. An unbroken bowl is a fine, ordinary thing, the abbot. It has never been tested. It has never had to be made whole again by patient hands. This bowl, though this bowl has a history now, written right across it in gold, that no untouched bowl could ever claim. It does not pretend the break never happened. It does not hide the seam under some clever glaze, pretending to be as it was before. It simply says, plainly, "Here is where I broke, and here is how I was made whole again." And the gold seam is not a flaw to apologize for. It is the most honest part of the whole bowl. He set it down gently on the table between them. "You have come to me more than once, troubled by some old grief or old failure you carry, wishing you could simply go back to being whole the way you were before whatever broke you. But perhaps wholeness was never about returning to some earlier, uncracked version of yourself. Perhaps it is closer to this bowl taking the break itself, gently, patiently, and filling it with something valuable, until the very place where you broke becomes the place where the light catches most beautifully now, rather than a wound you must hide for the rest of your days." Tao picked up the bowl carefully and turned it in the lamplight, watching the thin gold seam catch and release the glow with each small movement. "It does not need to apologize for the crack," he said slowly, half to himself. "No," the abbot agreed. "It only needs to let the gold do what gold does, which is shine exactly where it has been placed, without shame, without hurry, and without any need to pretend the break never happened at all." There is a final teaching for tonight, smaller and quieter than the rest, carried by nothing more than an old stone and a great deal of patient water. Below the river Hermitage, where the current narrowed briefly between two rocky banks before widening out again toward the rice fields, there stood a single large grey stone that had sat in that same spot, by all accounts, for longer than anyone in the village could remember. Generations of children had used it as a place to sit and dangle their feet in the cool water during the hot months. Generations of washerwomen had used its flat top to beat their laundry clean. And the whole time, unnoticed by almost everyone who used it, The river had been quietly working at one particular edge of the stone, wearing a smooth, shallow groove into its grey surface, a little deeper with each passing year. No single day's water had ever managed to carve that groove. No single flood, however high it rose, had ever been credited, on its own, with shaping the stone. It had taken decades of the same patient, unhurried current, returning every single day with no greater urgency than the day before, asking nothing of the stone except to simply keep flowing past it at the pace the river had always flowed, neither rushing to finish the job nor pausing out of any fear that the work was taking too long. An old fisherman who had sat beside that stone every evening of his adult life, mending nets in the day's last light, once told a young apprentice who had asked him why he never seemed troubled by how slowly his own skills were improving, that the river beside them had taught him everything he needed to know about patience, simply by being watched for long enough. The water never once tried to carve that groove faster than it was capable of carving it, the old fisherman said. It did not throw itself harder against the stone on the days it felt behind, the way a person does when they fear they are not progressing fast enough. It simply kept being water, kept doing the one thing water does, at the one pace water has ever moved. And the groove appeared anyway, in its own good time, deeper and smoother with each passing year, without the river ever once needing to hurry, or strain, or prove to anyone watching that it was working hard enough to deserve the shape it was slowly, patiently creating. The young apprentice looked at the smooth groove worn into the old stone, polished now to a soft, dark shine by decades of the same unhurried water, and understood, without needing it explained any further, that whatever he himself was hoping to become skilled, peaceful, whole was likely to arrive the same way, not through any single day's frantic effort, but through the same patient return, day after day, at exactly the pace that was actually his to give, trusting, the way the river trusted, that the shape would come, eventually, without ever once needing to be forced. There is another teaching from those same misty hills, one that unfolds more slowly than the others, and asks you to simply let it unfold, the way the morning fog over the river never hurries to lift, only thins, by degrees, until the far bank is visible again, almost without anyone noticing the exact moment it happened. In a quiet mountain monastery some distance from the river hermitage, considerably older and larger than the abbot's small thatched home, there lived a young monk named Rui, who had entered monastic life some 3 years earlier, fleeing, if he was honest with himself, a household of high expectations and a father who had never once, in 20 years, told him he had done enough. Rui had believed, arriving at the monastery gates as a younger man, that here at last he would find a place where rest was not just permitted, but built into the very architecture of the day's long hours of sitting. Simple meals, no ledgers to balance, no harvest to fear losing. And yet he had discovered, to his quiet dismay, that he had simply brought his father's voice inside the monastery walls with him. Now it was not his father asking whether he had studied enough, but Rui himself, lying awake on his thin sleeping mat each night, asking whether he had sat still enough, breathed correctly enough, achieved sufficient stillness to justify another full day's rice and shelter. The setting had changed entirely. The voice demanding he earn his place had not changed at all. One late spring afternoon, the head abbot of that monastery, an enormously old man named Master Yun, who had outlived 3 generations of his own students and walked now with a slow, rolling gait that seemed to take its time with every single step, found Rui sitting rigidly upright in the meditation hall, long after the appointed sitting period had ended, his shoulders set in a posture of visible strain rather than ease. The bell rang some time ago, Master Yun observed, settling himself down nearby with considerably less hurry than Rui had managed in 3 years of trying. Most of the others have gone to the garden or to rest before the evening meal. I have not sat well enough today, Rui admitted, not opening his eyes. My mind wandered 4 times during the morning sitting. I am trying to make up for it now, before I allow myself to stop." Master Yun was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Rui eventually opened his eyes to see whether the old man had perhaps fallen asleep where he sat. He had not. He was simply watching Rui with an expression of mild, unhurried curiosity, the way one might watch a bird attempting something slightly strange. "Tell me," Master Yun said finally, "have you ever watched a farmer plant rice?" "Many times," Rui said, somewhat impatiently, unsure what this had to do with anything. "Does the farmer, having planted the seedling in the flooded field, then crouch beside it all day and all night, gripping the stalk, willing it with all his strength to grow faster?" "Of course not," Rui said. "He plants it and tends the water level, and then he leaves it alone to do what rice does. He goes home, he sleeps. The growing happens whether he watches it happen or not. And if he did crouch, there, gripping the stalk day and night, refusing to leave, even to eat or sleep, convinced that his vigilance alone was what made the rice grow, what would happen to that particular stalk? Do you imagine? Compared to all the others he simply planted and trusted and walked away from." Rui considered this. "I suppose it would not grow any faster for his gripping it," he said slowly. "If anything, his constant handling might damage it. Young rice stalks are delicate. They don't want to be held so tightly." "You have been gripping your own stalk for 3 years now," Master Yun said, not unkindly. "Watching it constantly, day and night, convinced that the moment you look away or loosen your grip even slightly, your growth will stop, or worse, reverse, and you will have proven yourself unworthy of the rice and shelter this monastery has given you. But peace, like rice, does not actually grow any faster for being gripped. If anything, the gripping itself, the constant anxious checking, the refusal to ever simply plant the effort and then walk away and trust it is very likely the exact thing preventing the growth you are so desperately trying to force. Then what am I meant to do? Rui asked, and there was real frustration in it now. The frustration of a man who has tried very hard at exactly the wrong thing for a very long time, if not try harder. You are meant to plant the seedling honestly, each morning, Master Yun said. Sit when the bell calls you to sit. Breathe when you remember to breathe. Let your mind wander 4 times, or 40 times, without keeping a furious tally of your own failures each time it does. And then, this is the part you have never once allowed yourself. You are meant to walk away from the field afterward and trust the rest to happen in the dark, underground, exactly the way it always has for every farmer who has ever planted anything at all. You do not make the rice grow by refusing to leave it alone. You make space for the rice to grow by finally leaving it alone. Rui sat with this for a long time after Master Yun had risen, slowly, with his customary unhurried roll, and made his way toward the garden where the evening light was beginning to slant gold across the new vegetable beds. The hall grew quiet around Rui, the way it always did this time of day, the last of the afternoon light moving in long bars across the wooden floor, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he allowed his shoulders to drop from where they had been sitting, tight and high, somewhere up near his ears. He did not solve, in that single afternoon, the deeper question of his father's voice, still living somewhere inside him after 3 years of supposed escape. But he did, for the length of that one slow sunset, simply sit without gripping anything at all, not his breath, not his posture, not his own private tally of the day's failures and successes, and found, to his quiet astonishment, that the stillness that arrived in the absence of all that gripping felt, for the first time since his arrival at the monastery gates, something close to what he had originally come here, hoping to find. In the months that followed, Rui did not become, all at once, a monk who never gripped anything. Old patterns, built over 20 years in his father's house, do not dissolve in a single golden evening. But he began noticing, more and more often, the moments when his hands and his mind and his breath had quietly clenched around some task or some private standard he was failing to meet, and in noticing it, he found he could sometimes, not always, but sometimes, simply open his grip a little, the way a farmer opens his hand and lets the seedling stand on its own in the flooded field, trusting the dark work beneath the water to continue exactly as it always had, with or without his watching it. There is a second teaching now, this one belonging to a different kind of restless heart than the scholars or the young monks, the particular restlessness of someone who has built her worth entirely on being needed, and who discovers, almost by accident, what happens when that need quietly recedes. In a weaving village, some distance up a tributary stream from the great river, there lived a woman named Shwe, who had, since the age of 12, been considered the finest weaver in 3 villages, capable of producing in a single season what other weavers needed 2 seasons to complete. Her skill had become, over the decades, not simply a craft she practiced, but the entire architecture of who she understood herself to be. She was not merely a woman who wove in her own private accounting. She was valuable precisely and only to the degree that her loom kept producing day after day, without pause, without flaw, without a single empty hour in which her hands were not actively making something the village needed. When, in her later years, a trembling began in her hands, not severe, not yet disabling, but enough to slow her work and occasionally spoil a row of careful threading that she would then have to unpick and redo, Shwe found herself gripped by a fear far larger than the trembling itself seemed to warrant. She began rising earlier and earlier, working later and later into the night by candlelight, as though sheer additional hours could outrun a trembling that had nothing whatsoever to do with effort or diligence, and everything to do with the simple, unhurried arithmetic of age. One evening, exhausted and frustrated by a 3rd ruined row in as many hours, she set her shuttle down harder than she meant to and found herself, without quite deciding to go there, walking the short distance to the small roadside shrine at the edge of the village, where an old traveling nun had been resting for several days on her way further upriver. "My hands are failing me," Shwe said, more bluntly than she intended, sitting down on the shrine's worn stone step. "Not all at once. Just enough that my work is slower now, and sometimes flawed, when it was never flawed before in 40 years. I do not know who I am, if I am not the woman whose weaving never had a flaw in it." The nun, who had listened to a great many confessions over a great many years in a great many villages, did not rush to reassure her. She simply asked, after a thoughtful pause, "Tell me about the cloth you are most proud of from all your 40 years of weaving. Not the most perfect one, the one you are proudest of." Shwe considered this for a long moment, expecting to name some flawless bolt of silk from her younger years, woven in a single, uninterrupted week, without a single dropped thread. But instead, unexpectedly, what rose up in her memory was a much humbler piece, a blanket she had woven for her dying mother some 20 years earlier, worked in fits and starts between long nights of nursing, full of small irregularities, where her exhausted hands had occasionally lost the rhythm, where the tension varied subtly from row to row, in a way that a stranger's eye might have called imperfect. "It wasn't my best work, technically," Shwe admitted. "There are uneven places in it, if you know where to look, but I am proudest of that one. My mother slept under it every night until she died, and she always said it was the warmest thing she'd ever owned." "Was she warmed less?" the nun asked gently, "by the uneven rows than she would have been by perfectly even ones?" "No," Shwe said slowly. "If anything, she liked knowing the unevenness was there. She used to run her fingers over the places where the tension changed and say, 'That was the night you fell asleep at the loom and kept going anyway.' She loved it more, somehow, for not being flawless. Your value to this village," the nun said, "was never actually located in the flawlessness of your weaving, was it? It was located in the warmth the weaving carried, and warmth, it turns out, does not require perfect tension in every row. A slightly trembling hand does not necessarily make a colder blanket. It may, in fact, make one that carries something a steadier hand. Never could the simple, honest evidence that a person kept going, imperfectly, because the people relying on that cloth mattered more to her than her own flawless reputation. Shui sat with this for a long while in the gathering dusk, feeling something in her chest that had been clenched very tightly for some months, finally begin, by careful degrees, to loosen. I have been weaving for 40 years as though one flaw might unravel my entire worth, she said, eventually, as though the trembling in my hands were evidence I had finally become worthless, rather than simply evidence that I am, after all this time, still a living woman, growing older the way every living woman eventually does. The loom does not care how old your hands are, the nun said. It will take whatever thread you give it, steady or trembling, and turn it into whatever cloth your hands are actually capable of making today, not some imagined yesterday, not some feared, diminished tomorrow, only today, exactly as your hands currently are. That cloth may carry a little more unevenness in it now than it once did. It may also, like your mother's blanket, end up carrying something far warmer than perfection ever managed to weave on its own. In the seasons that followed, Shui did not stop weaving, and her hands did not stop trembling, the trembling being simply a fact of her age, rather than a problem awaiting a solution. But she stopped working by candlelight long past dark, trying to outrun a fear that had never actually been about thread count or tension at all. She allowed her irregular rows to remain irregular, sometimes even pointing them out to the women who came to buy her cloth, telling them, with something like pride rather than apology, that this was the place where her hand had trembled and that the warmth had not suffered one bit for it. And most of the women, hearing this, found that they wanted that particular blanket more than ever, not less, the trembling having become, in the end, simply one more honest thread in a life that had never needed to be flawless in order to be valuable. There is a teaching, too, about a question that arrived at the hermitage, not in words at all, but in the shape of a man's whole exhausted posture, and what the abbot did instead of answering it directly. Late one summer afternoon, when the heat lay heavy and golden over the river valley, and even the cicadas seemed to be working in slow, reluctant bursts, a man arrived at the hermitage gate, whom nobody recognized, not a villager, not a scholar from the capital, simply a traveler of perhaps 50 years, dust thick on his sandals, who introduced himself only as a builder of bridges, on his way between one commission and the next. "I do not have a question, exactly," the bridge builder said, when the abbot invited him to sit in the shade of the hermitage's small porch. "Only a tiredness I cannot seem to set down, even when the work itself is finished. I build a bridge. It stands. The river crosses beneath it, exactly as it should. And within a week, I am already 3 days into the next commission, the next river, the next set of timbers needing measuring, with no sense that the last bridge ever actually finished anything inside me, even though it plainly stands finished in the world." The abbot considered this for a while, watching the late light move across the river below them, gold deepening slowly toward amber as the afternoon wore on. "How many bridges have you built?" he asked. "In your lifetime so far?" 41, the bridge builder said, with the immediate precision of a man who has, in fact, kept exact count. 41 bridges, across 9 different provinces, not one of them yet collapsed. "And of those 41, the abbot said, how many have you returned to visit, simply to stand on them again, once they were finished, with no further work to do?" The bridge builder thought about this for a long moment, and something in his face shifted slightly, as though he had stumbled, by accident, onto an answer he had not been looking for. "None," he admitted. "Not one. The moment a bridge is finished, in my mind it already belongs to the people who will use it. I move on to the next river before the last one has even properly dried." "Tell me," the abbot said, "what is the actual purpose of a bridge once it is built?" "To be crossed," the bridge builder said, "to let people get from one bank to the other without wetting their feet or risking the current." "And does a bridge serve that purpose?" the abbot asked. "Only on the day it is finished, or does it continue serving that same purpose every single day afterward, for years, for generations, long after the builder himself has stopped thinking about it at all?" The bridge builder was quiet for a while, watching the river move beneath the hermitage, brown and steady in the late summer heat. "It serves its purpose every day," he said slowly. "Children cross my first bridge to get to school, even now, 20 years later. I have never once gone back to watch them do it. But they do it anyway, every morning, whether I am there to see it or not." "Then your work," the abbot said, "did not actually require your continued attention in order to keep mattering. The bridge goes on serving its purpose with or without your presence, with or without your private sense of having properly finished anything. You built 41 true and useful things in this world, and 41 times you denied yourself the simple, ordinary pleasure of standing on your own work and feeling, even for a single afternoon, that it was enough that you yourself, your particular hands, your particular care, had already done something worth pausing over. If I stop to feel that it's enough," the bridge builder said, and there was something almost like fear in it now. "I worry I will lose whatever has kept me moving toward the next bridge, and the next, all these years. The tiredness at least has a use. It pushes me onward." "Does it?" the abbot asked. "Or has it simply convinced you of that, the way a strict father convinces a child that only fear of his disapproval keeps the child working hard at all, when in truth, the child would have worked hard anyway, out of simple love for the work, if only the fear had ever once stepped aside long enough to let love show itself?" He gestured down toward the river, where, in the shallows near the bank, a single white heron stood motionless on one leg, watching the water with the kind of patient attention that asked nothing of the moment except to be fully present inside it. "That heron," the abbot said, "has caught more fish in its lifetime, I would wager, than any heron that spent its days anxiously rushing from one stretch of riverbank to the next, never once standing still long enough to actually watch the water closely. Stillness, real stillness, paid full attention rather than guilty distraction, is not the opposite of getting things done. It is very often the very thing that allows the next true thing to be seen clearly enough to be done well, rather than done merely fast." The bridge builder stayed at the hermitage 3 days longer than he had originally intended, doing very little beyond sitting on the porch in the long afternoons, watching the heron fish, watching the river carry small leaves and twigs pass toward the sea, watching the light change color as the day wore down each evening. On the morning he finally continued on toward his next commission, he stopped at the edge of the path and looked back at the hermitage for a long moment. "I think," he said, more to himself than to the abbot standing in the doorway, "I might go and stand on the first bridge I ever built, on my way to the new river, just to see it, just for an afternoon. I have never once allowed myself that, in 20 years. The bridge will still be standing," the abbot said. "It has been waiting rather patiently, I imagine, for you to finally come and see what you made. There is another teaching now, heavier in its subject but no less gentle in its telling, about a father who had lost a son and what he discovered when he finally allowed himself, after a long refusal, to simply sit still with the loss rather than burying himself in motion to avoid it. In a village further up the valley, where the rice terraces climbed the hillside in long green steps, there lived a farmer named Cheng whose only son had drowned in the river 2 summers before, swept away during an unexpected flood while trying foolishly and bravely to rescue a neighbor's goat that had wandered too close to the rising water. In the 2 years since, Cheng had not once spoken of his son's name aloud, and had instead expanded his farm relentlessly, buying additional terraces, taking on more labor than any one man needed, working from before dawn until well past dark, every single day, including the festival days, when even the most diligent farmers in the valley allowed themselves rest. His wife, who grieved differently and more openly, had pleaded with him more than once to simply sit with her in the evenings, to let himself feel what he was so plainly carrying. Cheng could not. Each time he slowed, even for a moment, the weight of it rose in his chest like floodwater finding a crack in a riverbank, and he would immediately find some new task, some additional terrace needing clearing, anything to keep the water from rising any further. One autumn evening, exhausted past the point of useful work, Cheng found himself, almost without deciding to go there, at the door of the small village shrine, where the old traveling abbot from the river hermitage happened, that season, to be staying for some weeks while visiting an ailing relative nearby. Cheng had not intended to speak with anyone. He had only wanted, he told himself, a quiet place to sit for a few minutes before returning home. But the old abbot was there on the shrine's worn step, and something in the man's stillness made it impossible, somehow, for Cheng to simply walk past without a word. "I do not know how to stop working," Cheng admitted, sitting down heavily beside the abbot, the confession coming out of him with none of the careful composure he usually maintained. "If I stop, even for an evening, I am afraid of what I will have to feel. My son, the river, the goat that wasn't even worth his life. I cannot let myself sit still with any of it. The work is the only thing keeping the water back." The abbot listened without interrupting and let a long silence settle between them before he finally spoke. "Tell me about your son," he said simply, "not how he died. Tell me something true about how he lived." Cheng's eyes filled unexpectedly, and for a long moment he could not speak at all. "He laughed at everything," he said finally, his voice rough. "Even things that weren't funny. He laughed at the rain when it ruined a harvest. He laughed at his own mistakes before anyone else could. His mother used to say he laughed the way some men breathe automatically, without deciding to, simply because it was the most natural thing his body knew how to do. And in 2 years of relentless work," the abbot said gently, "how often have you allowed yourself to remember that laugh, rather than only the river that took him?" Cheng was quiet for a long time. "Almost never," he admitted. "I think I have been so afraid of the grief that I have buried the boy along with it. I cannot seem to find one without dragging up the other." "Ah, they are not actually the same water," the abbot said. "Grief is the flood, but the laugh you just described to me, that is not floodwater at all. That is something the river never touched, something that belonged to your son before the river ever entered the story, and belongs to your memory of him, still, completely untouched by how he died. You have been refusing to sit still because you believe stillness will only ever bring you the flood. But sometimes, if a person can bear to sit still long enough, past the first hard rise of the water, what surfaces afterward is not only grief, it is also the laugh. It is also the boy himself, fully alive in memory, in a way your relentless work has been keeping at arm's length right alongside the grief, because you did not know how to separate the two." Cheng sat with this for a long while in the gathering dusk, and for the first time in 2 years, he allowed himself to simply remain still, without immediately rising to find some new terrace to clear, some new task to bury himself inside. The grief did rise, as he had feared it would, sharp and sudden and almost unbearable for several long minutes. But behind it, exactly as the abbot had suggested, came something else as well. A clear, sudden memory of his son, at perhaps 7 years old, laughing so hard at a frog that had jumped unexpectedly into his rice bowl that he had fallen backward off the porch step, still laughing even as he landed in the mud below. Cheng found himself laughing too, quietly, there on the shrine step in the dusk, the laugh arriving strangely tangled together with tears, both at once, neither one cancelling the other out. "I had forgotten that frog," he said, wiping his eyes. "I had forgotten I was even allowed to remember anything about him except the river. The river took his life," the abbot said quietly. "It was never able to take the laugh. That belongs to you now, completely safe, completely separate from the water, for as long as you are willing to sit still long enough to let it surface alongside the grief, rather than working yourself to exhaustion specifically to avoid feeling either one. Cheng did not stop farming his land in the months that followed, and he did not stop grieving his son, the grief never fully finishing the way a bridge finishes or a harvest finishes. But he began, in small ways, allowing himself quiet evenings again, sitting with his wife, telling her, finally, small remembered stories about their son's laugh, his foolish kindness toward a goat that hadn't deserved the risk he took for it, his particular way of falling off porch steps in helpless delight. The work on his farm slowed, somewhat, from its frantic 2-year pace. But something else, something that had been buried alongside the grief for far too long, began, very gradually, to breathe again. There is one more teaching belonging to this same gentle company, light and brief, about a question a stranger once asked in a crowded market, and the answer that arrived not from any wise teacher at all, but simply from watching closely. On a busy market day in the river town downstream from the hermitage, a traveling merchant new to the area found himself standing beside an old fruit seller's stall, watching the woman work with a steadiness that seemed almost out of place amid the shouting and haggling and general commotion of the crowded square around her. She weighed each piece of fruit with the same unhurried care, whether the customer in front of her was patient or irritable, whether the line behind them was short or stretched halfway across the square. "How do you stay so calm?" the merchant finally asked her, genuinely curious. "With so many people pressing in on you all day, every day, wanting your attention all at once." The old fruit seller did not look up from the persimmon she was weighing. "I am only ever serving the one customer in front of me," she said simply. "The others will each, in their turn, become the one customer in front of me. But right now, this moment, there is only this one person and this one piece of fruit, and nothing else actually requires my attention at all. The crowd only feels overwhelming if I try to serve all of it at once, which has never once, in 30 years, actually been a thing I was required to do." The merchant thought about this for a long while after he had continued on his way through the market, and found that it stayed with him longer than he expected. The simple, almost obvious truth that no person, however large the crowd pressing around them, is ever actually required to serve more than the one moment directly in front of them, one customer, one piece of fruit, one breath, at a time. There is a teaching now that takes place not at the hermitage at all, but at a ferry crossing some distance downriver, where the water ran wide and slow before narrowing again toward the sea, and where an old ferryman had spent the better part of 50 years carrying travelers from one bank to the other. A young official, newly appointed to a post in a distant province, arrived at this crossing one evening just as the light was beginning to fail, anxious to reach the far bank before full dark so he might continue on toward his new posting without losing an entire day to delay. He found the old ferryman sitting calmly on the near bank, mending a small tear in his boat's single-patched sail, in no apparent hurry at all despite the gathering dusk. "I need to cross immediately," the young official said, somewhat sharply, setting down his travel chest at the water's edge. "I cannot afford to lose this evening's light. My appointment awaits, and I have already lost 2 days to bad weather on the road." The old ferryman glanced up at the sky, where the last orange light was beginning to deepen toward purple along the western hills, and then back down at his sail, continuing his slow, careful stitching without any apparent change of pace. "The crossing takes exactly as long as the crossing takes," he said mildly. "No amount of your hurrying on this bank will make the boat move faster once we are on the water. The current decides that. Not you, and not me either, if it comes to that." "Then at least let us depart immediately," the young official pressed, "rather than you sitting here mending a sail that has clearly held together well enough to get us across before." The ferryman considered the small tear in his sail, no larger than 2 fingers' width, and then looked up at his impatient passenger with an expression of mild, unbothered curiosity. "Tell me," he said, "what do you imagine happens to a small tear in a sail if it is left unmended and the wind happens to gust hard partway across the crossing? The young official, despite his hurry, found himself considering this honestly. I suppose it could tear further, he admitted. Perhaps badly enough to slow us, or even strand us partway across if the wind were strong enough. And which delays you longer? The ferryman asked, returning to his stitching. The few minutes I spend now, mending a small tear properly before we ever leave this bank, or the considerably longer delay of being stranded mid-river with a torn sail and no wind to carry us the rest of the way, simply because I rushed past a small repair in order to satisfy your hurry. The young official had no immediate answer for this, and sat down, somewhat reluctantly, on a flat stone near the water's edge, to wait. You remind me, the ferryman continued, working his needle through the canvas with the same unhurried rhythm he had kept since before the official arrived, of a great many travelers I have carried across this water over 50 years, each one certain that their hurry was the most urgent hurry this river had ever seen, each one convinced that any pause at all, however brief, however necessary, was an unforgivable theft of their time. He tied off his stitch and held the sail up briefly to the failing light, checking his work. And yet in 50 years I have never once found that hurrying the preparation actually shortened the crossing itself. The river does not negotiate with urgency. It only ever responds to readiness, a sound boat, a mended sail, a ferryman who has taken the small amount of time needed to make sure the larger crossing will actually succeed. How do you know? The young official asked, somewhat more humbly now than when he had arrived. Which moments call for hurry and which call for this kind of patience? I confess I have spent most of my life unable to tell the difference. I treat every moment as though it demands my fastest possible motion, whether it actually does or not. The old ferryman finished his stitching at last and set the needle aside, looking out at the darkening water for a long moment before answering. I have found, after 50 years on this particular stretch of river, he said, that almost nothing actually requires the frantic hurry we bring to it. The crossing will happen. The sun will set whether or not you reach the far bank before it does, and in truth, this river is perfectly safe to cross by starlight, for a ferryman who knows its currents. So even your fear of arriving after dark was costing you more peace than the actual danger warranted. Very few things, in my experience, are made better by hurry. Mended sails are made better by patience. Safe crossings are made better by patience. Even arriving at one's new post a few hours later than originally hoped, with a clear head and a body that has not exhausted itself fighting against a river's own unhurried pace, tends to serve a person better than arriving exactly on schedule, hollowed out by an evening of needless strain. They crossed not long after, the mended sail catching the last of the evening wind cleanly, with no further tearing, and the young official sat quietly in the boat's stern, watching the dark water slide past, finding, somewhat to his own surprise, that the urgency that had gripped him so tightly on the near bank had loosened considerably, simply from sitting still long enough to let the old man finish his careful, unhurried work. I think, the young official said, as the far bank finally came into view, pale in the gathering starlight, that I have spent most of my career treating every crossing as though it were the only crossing that would ever matter, as though slowing down for even a moment might cost me everything. Most people do, the old ferryman said, guiding the boat the last short distance toward the dock with the same unhurried, practiced ease he had shown the entire crossing. It is, I think, one of the most common mistakes a person can make, believing that their own hurry is what holds the world together, when in truth, the world has been quite capable of turning at its own pace since long before any of us arrived to hurry it along, and will continue turning at that same pace long after we are gone, hurried or not. There is one more teaching belonging to this gentle company, this one set in a small tea house where an old woman had spent 40 years pouring tea for travelers, and what she came, eventually, to understand about the particular kind of rest that her own work had quietly been teaching her the entire time, without her ever quite noticing the lesson until late in her life. In a village at a crossroads where several trade routes met, there stood a small tea house run by a woman named Bao, who had inherited it from her own mother and had, in the 40 years since, served tea to more travelers than she could ever have hoped, to count merchants and soldiers and pilgrims and officials, each one arriving tired from the road, each one departing, an hour or two later, somewhat restored. For most of those 40 years, Bao had measured her own worth by how busy her tea house was. A full house meant she had done well. An empty afternoon, with no travelers passing through, filled her with a familiar unease, as though the tea house's quiet hours were evidence of some failure on her part, rather than simply the natural rhythm of a crossroads that could not always, every single hour, be full of passing trade. One particularly slow autumn afternoon, with not a single traveler in sight along any of the 4 roads meeting at her door, Bao found herself sitting alone among her own empty tables, the kettle cold, the cups stacked clean and unused on their shelf, feeling the old familiar unease rising in her chest. An elderly traveling monk, passing through on his way to a temple some days further along the eastern road, happened to step inside at exactly this moment, more out of simple curiosity at the tea house's stillness than any real need for tea. "You look troubled," the monk observed, settling himself at one of the empty tables, for a woman sitting in such a peaceful room. "I am troubled," Bao admitted, somewhat surprised at her own honesty with a stranger, "because the room is peaceful. An empty tea house, to me, has always meant I am failing at the one thing I know how to do." The monk looked around at the clean, quiet room, the swept floor, the neatly stacked cups, the cold kettle waiting patiently on its stand, and then back at Bao with an expression of genuine curiosity. "Tell me," he said, "what does this room look like exactly in its busiest hour, when every table is full and travelers are calling for tea from every direction at once?" Bao considered this. "Loud," she said. "Crowded. My hands moving faster than my feet can follow. Steam everywhere. No time to think. Barely time to pour correctly before the next cup is needed. And does the tea taste better in that busy hour than it does in a quiet hour like this one, when you have all the time in the world to prepare it properly?" Bao almost laughed. "No," she admitted. "If anything, the tea is better on the slow afternoons. I can let the leaves steep exactly as long as they need. I can warm the pot properly first. On the busy days, I am rushing so much that I sometimes pour it a little early, a little weak, just to keep the line of waiting travelers from growing any longer. Then this quiet afternoon," the monk said gently, "is not actually evidence of your failure at all, is it? It may, in fact, be the very condition under which your true skill, the careful, patient preparation that makes your tea worth traveling for in the first place, has the most room to fully express itself. The crowded hours may be when your business proves itself most visibly. But this quiet hour might be when your craft proves itself most completely, even though no one but the 2 of us happens to be here to taste it." He accepted the tea she poured him in that quiet hour, slow, careful, the leaves given every minute they needed, the water at exactly the right temperature, rather than rushed to a boil and poured before it had properly settled, and pronounced it, with evident sincerity, the finest cup he had been served in his entire journey so far. 40 years, Bao said, watching him drink, something in her chest loosening that had been tight for longer than she could easily remember, and I have spent nearly every quiet afternoon among them, feeling as though the stillness itself was a kind of failure. I never once considered that the stillness might be where the actual quality of my work was finally given room to breathe. A tea house, like a person, the monk said, setting down his cup, needs both kinds of hours to be whole, the busy hours that prove its usefulness to the world, and the quiet hours that prove to itself that it has not lost the careful patience that made it worth being useful in the first place. Neither hour is the failure of the other. They are simply two different and equally necessary halves of the very same craft. Bao thought of this often in the years that followed, on every quiet afternoon when no traveler happened to be passing through her crossroads, and found that the old familiar unease, while it never entirely vanished, grew gentler each time she remembered to let the quiet hours simply be what they were not, an empty failure to apologize for, but the necessary, unhurried other half of a craft that needed both motion and stillness in order to remain, across 40 years, genuinely worth a traveler's trust. There is a teaching now about a stonemason whose hands had spent 30 years shaping rock into temple steps and garden walls, and who came to the river hermitage carrying a worry that had nothing to do with stone at all, though it took him some time to discover this. In the hills above the hermitage, where good building stone could be quarried from a grey outcrop that had supplied half the temples in the valley, there lived a stonemason named Old Do, who was, by every measure his neighbours could think to apply, a man who had achieved everything a stonemason might reasonably hope to achieve. His steps did not crack in winter frost the way lesser work sometimes did. His garden walls stood straight after 20 years, where other masons' walls had long since begun to lean. Temples, 3 villages distant, sent for him specifically, paying well for the certainty of his careful, patient craft. And yet Old Do, nearing 60 now, had begun to notice something that troubled him more than any flaw in his stonework ever had. He no longer knew how to simply sit in a room without some piece of stone in his hands, turning it, assessing it, looking for the grain along which it might one day be split. Even at his own table, eating the evening meal his wife had prepared, his fingers would find some small pebble from his pocket and begin, almost without his noticing, to turn it over and over, searching for a fault line that wasn't there to find, simply because his hands no longer remembered how to be still. One evening, delivering a finished gatepost to the river hermitage at the abbot's request, Old Do found himself staying longer than the task required, sitting on the hermitage step as the light failed, turning a small chip of leftover stone between his fingers without quite realizing he was doing it. "You are working that stone," the abbot observed, settling down nearby, though there is no commission requiring it, and the light has nearly gone besides. Old Do looked down at his own hands, faintly surprised to find them occupied at all. "I don't always notice I'm doing it," he admitted. 30 years of needing my hands to be useful every waking hour, I suppose. I'm not sure they remember how to simply rest in my lap anymore, doing nothing at all. "Tell me about your finest piece of work," the abbot said. "Not the largest, not the most expensive, the one you yourself are proudest to have made." Old Do did not need to think long. "The lotus carved into the threshold stone of the temple 3 villages east," he said, "took me the better part of a season. Every petal had to follow the stone's own grain, or it would have cracked within a year of foot traffic crossing it." "And how did you know," the abbot asked, "where the grain ran, before you ever lifted your chisel?" "I had to sit with the stone first," Old Do said, and something in his own answer seemed to catch him by surprise as he said it. "For days, sometimes, just looking at it, turning it in the light at different hours, feeling where it wanted to be worked and where it would resist. If I'd rushed straight to the chisel without that sitting, I'd have fought the stone's own nature instead of working with it, and the lotus would have split wrong within the first winter. So the stillness," the abbot said, "the days of simply sitting and looking, doing nothing visible at all to anyone watching from outside that stillness, was not separate from your finest work. It was the foundation underneath it. Without those quiet days of doing nothing but looking, the chisel work that followed would have been worse, not better, for having skipped straight to motion." Old Do turned this over slowly, the way he might have turned a piece of stone, looking for the grain in it. "I have forgotten that part of my own craft," he said finally, Somewhere in 30 years, I started believing that only the chisel work counted as real labor, and the sitting and looking was just delay before the real work began. I stopped allowing myself the days of stillness and started rushing straight to the cutting on every piece for years now. I wonder how much of my recent work has been fighting the stone's grain instead of following it, simply because I no longer trust myself to sit still long enough to find the grain first. Your hands have not forgotten how to rest, the abbot said. They have simply not been given the occasion in a very long time. A hand that has spent 30 years finding its worth only in motion needs to be reminded, gently, that the stillness before the chisel was never wasted time. It was the part of the craft that made everything afterward possible at all. Old Du sat a while longer on the hermitage step, the small stone chip finally going still in his open palm, rather than turning over and over between his fingers, and watched the last color drain slowly out of the sky above the river, taking no particular notice of how long he sat there, or whether the sitting itself was producing anything a passerby might call useful. It was, he thought, perhaps the first time in some years he had simply let his hands rest open and empty, without immediately needing to fill them with some task to justify the stillness. There is one further small teaching, brief and quiet, carried by someone the hermitage never learned the name of at all. The way certain teachings arrive from people who pass through a single afternoon and are gone again before anyone thinks to ask who they were. One hot afternoon in early summer, a traveler stopped at the hermitage well to draw water, exhausted from a long morning's walk, and found Tao there resting in the shade of the well's small wooden roof. They fell into easy conversation, as travelers and apprentices sometimes do, about nothing in particular: the heat, the dust of the road, the look of the river from this height compared to lower down the valley. "You seem unhurried," the traveler observed, watching Tao draw water for him, with none of the brisk efficiency most innkeepers and well-tenders displayed along the road. Most people drawing water for a stranger are eager to finish the task and return to whatever they were doing before I interrupted them. "I was doing nothing before you interrupted me," Tao said, smiling slightly. "Only sitting in the shade, the same as you are now." "Doesn't that trouble you?" the traveler asked, genuinely curious. "Sitting and doing nothing, while the day passes. Where I come from, a person caught sitting idle is assumed to be either lazy or unwell." Tao considered the question honestly before answering. "I used to believe the same thing," he admitted. "I arrived here some seasons ago, convinced that every quiet hour was an hour stolen from somewhere I ought to have been working instead. The old abbot has been teaching me, slowly, that this isn't quite true, that some hours are meant simply to be lived in, rather than spent on something." "And has it helped?" the traveler asked. "This unlearning? Some days," Tao said. "Other days the old guilt comes back as strong as ever, and I have to remind myself all over again. I don't think the unlearning happens all at once, the way the learning of the guilt happened, drop by drop, over years. I think it has to be unlearned the same slow way, drop by drop, sitting in the shade by a well, one ordinary hot afternoon at a time, with nothing in particular to show for it afterward except having simply, quietly, been here." The traveler drank his water, thanked Tao, and continued on his way down the dusty road, and Tao never learned his name, or where he had been traveling from, or where he was finally headed. But he thought of the conversation now and again in the weeks that followed, the way certain small exchanges with strangers sometimes stay with a person far longer than conversations with people they know well. Perhaps, Tao thought, because a stranger has no history with you yet, no old expectation of who you are supposed to be, and so can simply ask the plain question and hear, just as plainly, whatever true answer happens to be sitting closest to the surface that particular afternoon. There is a teaching now about a young woman newly married into a large household who believed, in her first years there, that her worth could only ever be proven through constant, visible effort, and what slowly taught her otherwise. in a large farming household some distance from the river, where 3 generations lived together under one roof and the work of keeping such a household running never seemed to fully end, there came, one autumn, a young bride named Yan, married into the family at 19, eager beyond words to prove herself worthy of the welcome her new mother-in-law had extended. For the first 2 years of her marriage, Yan rose before everyone else in the household and went to sleep after everyone else as well, taking on task after task without ever once being asked to, convinced that any moment spent not visibly working would be noticed, judged, and held against her by a family she still, in her own private accounting, had not fully earned her place within. She swept floors that had already been swept. She offered to mend clothes that did not need mending. She hovered at mealtimes, refilling bowls before they were even half empty, unable to simply sit and eat alongside the others without finding some small task to justify her presence at the table. Her mother-in-law, an observant woman named Granny Shu who had run this household for over 30 years, watched this behavior with growing concern rather than the approval Yan assumed she was earning. One quiet afternoon, finding Yan once again scrubbing a stone step that had been scrubbed only the day before, Granny Shu finally sat down on the step beside her and gently took the cloth from her hands. "Sit with me a moment," she said, "and tell me honestly, do you believe that if I caught you resting even once for even a single afternoon, I would think less of you?" Yan's hands, suddenly empty, did not seem to know what to do with themselves. "I am afraid you would," she admitted quietly. "I am afraid everyone would. I came into this family with nothing of my own to offer, except my willingness to work. If I stop proving that willingness, even for an hour, I worry there will be nothing left here that makes me worth keeping. S, 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 S. Granny Shu was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the courtyard where the autumn light fell gold across the swept stones. "When my own son first brought you here," she said, "do you know what I noticed about you before you had lifted a single broom in this household?" Yan shook her head. "I noticed how gently you spoke to your own mother at the wedding when she was nervous and fussing over small details no one else cared about. I noticed how you laughed, genuinely, at my husband's terrible old jokes, the ones even his own children have stopped pretending to find funny. I noticed the way you looked at my son when you thought no one was watching, not the look of a girl performing affection for an audience, but something quieter and more real than that." She patted Yan's hand. "None of that required a single swept floor to prove it. I had already decided, before you ever picked up a broom in this house, that I was glad my son had chosen you." "Then why?" Yan asked, bewildered. "Have I spent 2 years exhausting myself trying to earn something I apparently already had?" "Because you arrived believing, the way many young brides do, that love and belonging in a new household must be purchased through constant labor, the way one might purchase goods at a market," Granny Shu said. "But this is not a market, Yan. We did not take you in on the condition that you work without rest until you have repaid some invisible debt for the privilege of joining us. You belong here the same way my own daughters belong here, not because of what your hands produce every waking hour, but because of who you actually are, underneath all that frantic proving." "I don't know how to simply stop," Yan said, and there was real fear in it. "If I'm not working, I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing instead. I don't know how to just sit at this table and exist without some task in my hands to justify the chair I'm sitting in." "Then we will practice it together," Granny Shu said. "The way you might practice any new skill you weren't taught as a girl. Tomorrow, you will sit at the table after the meal is finished, and you will not clear a single bowl, and you will simply talk with the rest of us, or say nothing at all, if you prefer, for the length of 1 cup of tea. That is the whole task. Sitting, existing, being present at this table because you are part of this family, not because your hands are currently producing something useful." It was, Yan found in the weeks that followed, a far harder practice than any physical labor she had ever undertaken. Her hands ached, in their own strange way, for something to occupy them. Her mind raced to find some task left undone, some small failure to address. But slowly, cup of tea by cup of tea, sitting at that table doing nothing more than existing among people who had, it turned out, already decided to love her long before she ever picked up a broom on their behalf, Yan began to learn what Granny Shu had been trying gently to teach her all along, that her place in that household, like a stone already firmly set into a wall, did not need constant proving in order to remain exactly where it belonged. There is one final teaching for tonight's gentle company, about a pilgrim who had walked a very long way in search of enlightenment, and what he discovered, at last, when he finally arrived somewhere and simply stopped walking. A man named Han had spent 11 years of his life walking from temple to temple across the empire, visiting every renowned teacher whose name he had ever heard spoken with reverence, asking each one the same question he had carried with him since his journey began. How does a person achieve true enlightenment? Each teacher had offered some variation of an answer, through discipline, through study, through service, through silence, and Han had dutifully attempted each path in turn, certain that the next temple, the next teacher, the next 11 years if it came to that, would finally deliver him to the destination he had been seeking for so long. He arrived at the river Hermitage on a soft spring evening, footsore and considerably thinner than when his journey had begun, having heard, in a village some days back, that an old abbot there sometimes had unusual insight into questions that other teachers found difficult to answer satisfactorily. "I have walked for 11 years, Han told the abbot, sitting heavily on the worn step outside the hermitage door, visiting every wise teacher in the empire, asking each one how to achieve enlightenment. I am exhausted in a way that sleep no longer touches. And I am no closer to an answer than I was on the first day of my journey." The abbot looked at this thin, weary traveler for a long moment before responding. "Tell me," he said, "in 11 years of walking, from temple to temple, how many full days have you simply stopped, not to sleep, not to eat, not to ask your question of yet another teacher, but simply to sit still in one place, with nowhere further to walk to, for the length of an entire day?" Han considered this honestly and found, to his own quiet dismay, that the answer was almost none. Every day of his 11 years had been organized around motion, walking toward the next temple, sitting briefly with the next teacher, then walking onward again the moment that teacher's instruction had been received, eager to begin applying it somewhere new before the previous teacher's words had even properly settled. "None, I think," he admitted, "or very few. I have always believed the answer was waiting at the next temple, never at the one where I currently stood. And so for 11 years, the abbot said, you have been searching for stillness by means of constant motion. You have asked teacher after teacher how to stop seeking, while never once allowing yourself to actually stop seeking long enough to discover what might be waiting underneath the seeking itself. Then what would you have me do?" Han asked, and there was an exhaustion in his voice that went well beyond his tired feet. "Stay here? Walk no further? I would have you do nothing at all," the abbot said. "Not as a new instruction to follow, the way you have followed 11 years of instructions from 11 years of teachers, simply as an experiment, for however long you are willing to try it. Sit on this step, watch the river. When the urge rises in you to ask a question, or to rise and continue walking towards some new temple, simply notice the urge and see what happens if you do not obey it immediately." Han sat on that step for the rest of the afternoon, and then through the evening, and the urge to rise, to ask, to continue his long search, did rise in him many times, exactly as the abbot had predicted, a restless itching just beneath his skin, a familiar and insistent voice telling him that surely there was a more useful temple further upriver, a wiser teacher he had not yet consulted, an answer still waiting just beyond the next bend in the road, that he was wasting precious time by sitting here instead of pursuing. But he did not rise. He sat and watched the river darken from gold to grey to a deep, starlit black, and listened to the water moving past exactly as it had moved past for centuries before his 11 years of walking had ever begun, and would continue moving past for centuries after he was gone. Somewhere in the depth of that long, motionless evening, without any single dramatic moment he could point to afterward and call the instant of his enlightenment, Han noticed that the restless itching beneath his skin had grown quiet. Not gone entirely, old patterns built over 11 years rarely vanish all at once, but quiet enough that he could sit beside it, the way one sits beside a sleeping child, without needing to silence it forever in order to finally rest. "I do not think I have found what I was looking for," he said to the abbot, much later, when the night had grown full and the stars had wheeled some distance across the sky above the river. "Perhaps," the abbot said, "you have simply stopped looking for it in the one place it could never have been found at the end of 11 more years of walking towards some next temple that was always going to feel, the moment you arrived, exactly as incomplete as every temple before it. The river does not search for stillness by rushing toward the sea faster. It finds its own stillness simply by being exactly where it currently is, moving at exactly the pace it is already moving, without needing to arrive anywhere else first in order to be, right now, completely and entirely itself." Han stayed at the river hermitage some weeks longer than he had planned, walking nowhere at all, and found, in the unhurried stillness of those weeks, something that 11 years of searching across the breadth of the empire had never once managed to deliver to him. Not an answer, exactly, but the simple, settled willingness to stop demanding one, and to let the river and the evening and his own quiet breath simply be enough, exactly as they already were. There is one more teaching belonging to this gentle company before the night settles further still, about an old gardener who tended the hermitage's modest grounds for many years, and a lesson he taught not through any words at all, but simply through the particular way he worked. The hermitage gardens were never large: a modest vegetable patch, a stand of bamboo, the crooked plum tree by the door, a few flowering shrubs that the previous abbot had planted decades before anyone currently living there had arrived. They were tended, for as long as Tao had been at the hermitage, by an old man named Shen the Elder, not to be confused with the soldier from an earlier telling, who came up from the village 3 mornings a week to weed and prune and water, asking no payment beyond the occasional meal and the simple pleasure, he always said, of working in good soil. Tao noticed, in his early months at the hermitage, that Shen the Elder worked at a pace unlike any gardener he had previously known. Where other workers Tao had observed moved briskly from task to task, eager to complete the day's full list before the light failed, Shen the Elder seemed to move through the garden as though time itself had agreed to wait patiently for him. He would kneel beside a single row of vegetables for what felt, to Tao's impatient young eye, like an unreasonably long while, simply observing before he ever lifted his trowel, checking the color of the leaves, the moisture of the soil, the particular angle at which a stem had begun to lean, before deciding what, if anything, that particular plant actually needed from him that morning. "You could finish twice as much in a day," Tao observed once, watching the old gardener spend a full quarter-hour simply studying a single ailing squash vine before doing anything to it at all. If you moved a little faster between each task. Shen the Elder did not look up from the vine, continuing his slow, careful examination of its yellowing leaves. "I could," he agreed mildly. "And in 20 years of gardening at that faster pace, in my younger days, I killed a great many more plants than I have killed in the 20 years since I slowed down." "How does moving slower save the plants?" Tao asked, genuinely curious now. "Because a plant that is struggling," Shen the Elder said, "is almost always trying to tell you something specific. Too much water, too little, a pest hidden beneath the leaves, soil gone sour from sitting too long without turning. But it can only tell you these things if you actually stop long enough to look closely and listen for the telling. A gardener moving quickly from task to task, eager to finish the full row before midday, sees only the general shape of trouble. This plant looks unwell and applies whatever remedy comes fastest to hand, often the wrong one, because he never paused long enough to discover what was actually needed. He gestured at the vine before him. This one, for instance, looks at first glance as though it needs more water. A quick gardener would water it generously and move on, satisfied. But look here, he parted the lower leaves, gently, revealing a cluster of small grey insects clustered along the stem's underside. It is not thirsty at all. It is being eaten, quietly, from below, where a hurried eye would never think to look. More water would only have made the soil more hospitable to the very insects causing the trouble in the first place. Dao looked at the small insects, invisible from any distance, and understood, for the first time, the actual purpose behind the old gardener's apparently unproductive slowness. The same is true of people, I think, Shen the Elder added, returning to his careful work of clearing the insects by hand, rather than reaching for some faster, more violent remedy. Though I am only a gardener, and claim no particular wisdom about people beyond what working alongside plants for 50 years has taught me by accident. A person who looks unwell, tired, irritable, withdrawn, is also, almost always, trying to tell those around them something specific. But if everyone around that person is moving too quickly to actually stop and look closely, they apply whatever remedy comes fastest to hand. More work, often, mistaking exhaustion for laziness, needing correction, or false cheerfulness, mistaking grief for a bad mood that simply needs distracting. The quick remedy frequently makes the real trouble worse, the same way more water would have fed those insects rather than starving them out. So the slowness itself, Tao said slowly, working it through, is not the opposite of caring for something properly. It's actually a requirement of caring for it properly. I have come to believe so, Shen the Elder said, finishing his careful work along the vine's stem and sitting back to examine his progress. A garden tended in haste produces, in my long experience, a great many more dead plants than a garden tended slowly, even though the hasty gardener appears, on any single afternoon, to be accomplishing so much more. The slow gardener accomplishes less in any given hour, and a very great deal more across an entire season, because his plants are actually thriving, rather than merely surviving his good intentions. He moved on, eventually, to the next row, at exactly the same unhurried pace, kneeling, observing, listening for whatever each particular plant might be quietly telling him before he ever lifted a tool on its behalf. And Tao, watching him work that way, season after season, slowly came to understand that the old gardener's apparent slowness was not laziness wearing a patient disguise. It was, instead, a far deeper and more demanding form of attention than mere busy hurry had ever managed to offer, the kind of attention that could only be paid by someone willing to set aside, for as long as the looking required, the constant inner pressure to simply move on to the next visible task. In time, Tao began bringing this same, slow, observant attention to his own meditation practice, and to his own tired body when it ached after a long day, and even to his own restless mind when it spun with some worry that, examined hastily, looked like simple anxiety, but, examined slowly and patiently, often turned out to be something more specific and more tender underneath a fear not yet named, a grief not yet fully felt, a need not yet spoken aloud even to himself. He found, the way Shen the Elder's plants had found, that whatever in him had been struggling tended to thrive far better under this slower, more careful attention than it ever had under his own earlier habit of reaching hastily for whatever remedy came fastest to hand, simply to make the discomfort of not knowing pass by a little more quickly. There is one last small teaching for tonight, gentle and brief, about a question that came to the hermitage from a child, much as the very first small teaching tonight came from a child, though this child carried a different worry entirely. A little girl from the village, the granddaughter of the old woman May, whose own quiet courtyard sitting we visited earlier this evening, came up to the hermitage one warm afternoon with her grandmother, curious about the place where her grandmother now spent so many peaceful hours. While the two old women sat, talking quietly in the shade, the little girl wandered the small garden, eventually finding Tao kneeling beside the vegetable beds, weeding alongside Shen the elder. "Why do grown-ups feel guilty about resting?" she asked Tao directly, with the particular bluntness only a child fully possesses, unburdened yet by the careful diplomacy adults learn to apply to large questions. "My grandmother used to never sit still at all. Now she sits still all the time, and she seems happier, but sometimes I still see her looking worried, like she's about to apologize to someone for sitting there." Tao set down his trowel and considered the question seriously, the way he had learned, slowly, over his seasons at the hermitage, to take a child's plain question exactly as seriously as a scholar's elaborate one. "I think," he said, "grown-ups spend so many years being told that their worth comes only from what they produce, that the habit settles very deep, deeper than any single happy afternoon can fully undo. Your grandmother is happier now, but the old habit of feeling she must always be earning her place sometimes still visits her, the way an old familiar guest sometimes knocks on a door long after they've actually moved away." "Does the habit ever go away completely?" the little girl asked. "I'm not sure," Tao admitted honestly. "I think, for some people, it grows quieter and quieter the longer they practice resting without apology, the way a fading echo eventually becomes too soft to notice at all. But I don't know that it disappears entirely, the way a stain might wash all the way out of cloth. Perhaps it simply becomes small enough, eventually, that it no longer runs the whole show." The little girl thought about this with the particular gravity small children sometimes bring to questions that adults have long since learned to leave only half examined. "I don't think I want to learn that habit at all then," she said decisively. "If it takes so long to unlearn, I'd rather just never learn it in the first place." Tao smiled at this, finding in it a wisdom he suspected the girl herself did not yet fully recognize as wisdom. "That," he said, "may be the single most useful thing anyone has said to me at this hermitage in quite some time. Perhaps the kindest thing the rest of us could do, watching you grow up, is to make sure you never learn that rest needs earning in the first place, so you never have to spend years of your own life slowly, painfully unlearning it, the way your grandmother and I and so many others before us have had to." The little girl, satisfied with this answer in the straightforward way children often are satisfied with answers that adults continue turning over in their minds for years afterward, returned to chasing a butterfly through the garden's far corner, entirely unburdened by any guilt at all about the fact that chasing butterflies produced absolutely nothing of practical value to anyone. Tao watched her go and thought of the scholar who had arrived with his cup already full, and the farmer who had finally learned the field would not punish him, and the old woman who had learned that her worth had never actually depended on her constant giving, and found that each of these long, careful unlearnings, taken together, amounted to exactly the same simple thing the little girl had just stated outright, with none of the decades of struggle the rest of them had needed in order to arrive at it. That rest had never required earning at all. Not for the scholar, not for the farmer, not for the bell, not for the old gardener's patient vines, and not, in the end, for any one of them. However long it had taken each weary heart to finally believe it. There is one more small teaching before we let the stories rest tonight, gentler even than the last. Almost no story at all closer to a single breath held quietly between two larger ones. In the hours just before dawn, when the river hermitage was at its most still, the abbot would sometimes simply sit on the wooden step outside his door, doing, by any outward measure, absolutely nothing at all. No sutra in his hands, no incense burning, no visitor to receive, no question to answer. Just an old man sitting while the dark slowly thinned toward grey, and the birds had not yet decided whether it was truly morning. Tao, waking early one such morning and finding the abbot already there on the step, asked very quietly, so as not to disturb whatever stillness the old man seemed to be keeping, what exactly he was doing. Waiting, the abbot said, without turning around. Waiting for what? For nothing in particular, the abbot said. That is rather the point of it. Tao sat down on the step beside him, and for a long while, neither of them spoke. The sky lightened by degrees so gradual that it was impossible to say, looking at it directly, that any change was happening at all, and yet, each time Tao glanced away and back again, the dark had thinned a little further. The shapes of the bamboo and the river had grown a little clearer, without either of them having done a single thing to bring the morning any closer. It would come anyway, Tao said eventually, half to himself. The morning, whether we sat here watching for it or not. Yes, the abbot agreed. Then why sit here at all? The abbot considered this for a while before answering. Because most of what we spend our days chasing, he said, would also arrive anyway, in its own time, whether we chased it or simply sat quietly and let it come to us instead. We have simply forgotten how to tell the difference between the things that genuinely need our striving and the things that only ever needed our patience. Sitting here, watching the dark become morning without lifting a finger to hurry it, is how I keep remembering which is which. The birds began, somewhere in the bamboo, their first uncertain notes of the day, and the two of them sat together a while longer, watching the river below the hermitage catch its first pale gleam of light, asking nothing further of the morning than to let it arrive in its own unhurried time. And now, dear friend, we return one last time to where this evening began, to the scholar and his cup and the small, quiet ending that was waiting for him all along. It happened that the scholar who had come to the river hermitage that first misty morning, the one whose cup had overflowed with old, stale water before the abbot's fresh tea could ever find a place to settle, did not leave again right away. He found, to his own surprise, that he was not in any great hurry to return to the capital and his towers of unread commentary. He asked the abbot, somewhat shyly, whether he might stay a few days longer, and the abbot, who never seemed surprised by such requests, simply nodded and showed him where he might sleep. The scholar stayed through that week, and then through the following one, helping with small tasks around the hermitage, carrying water, weeding the small vegetable garden, sweeping the stone step each morning, none of it especially scholarly work, all of it strangely restful, in a way his books had never quite managed to be. He noticed, gradually, that the towering stacks of argument he usually carried in his mind had begun, very slowly, to grow quieter, the way a loud room grows quieter once the largest, most insistent voice in it finally stops speaking, and simply listens for a while instead. One morning, near the end of the second week, the gentle spring rains that the valley was known for finally arrived, not the hard, urgent rain of summer storms, but a soft, patient rain that fell for hours without any particular hurry, soaking quietly into the new soil, beading on the unfolding plum blossoms, filling the river by slow degrees rather than any sudden flood. The scholar, standing under the small overhang outside the hermitage door, watching this rainfall, noticed his own cup sitting empty on the step where he had left it the evening before, after their tea, the same cup, now thoroughly emptied and dried, that had once overflowed with old water on his very first morning here. Without quite deciding to, he reached down and set it out past the overhang, into the open rain, and went back inside to continue his small chores. He did not think of it again until that evening, when the abbot, returning from a walk along the river in the last of the rain, paused by the step and picked up the cup, now filled nearly to its rim with clean, fresh rainwater, collected without a single moment of effort on the scholar's part, no carrying, no pouring, no scholarly striving of any kind. The cup had simply been set out, empty, into a sky that was already, patiently, falling. The abbot carried it inside and set it on the table between them. "You did not fill this cup," he observed, with the faintest trace of something that might, on another man's face, have been called a smile. "No," the scholar agreed, looking at the clear water inside it, faintly silvered by the last grey light coming through the window. "I only emptied it and set it where the rain could reach it. The rest happened entirely on its own." "And how did that feel?" the abbot asked. "Compared to all those years of carrying your cup from library to library, trying to fill it yourself, one careful pour at a time, out of books that never seemed to hold quite enough?" The scholar considered the question honestly. "Lighter," he said finally. "I did not strain for this water at all. I only had to stop being so full of old water that there was no room left for new rain to land." He looked up at the abbot, and for the first time since his arrival that misty first morning, the question he had originally carried up the mountain path, how does one find peace? When peace will not come, no matter how hard one searches, no longer felt quite so urgent or quite so far away. It felt, instead, a little like the rain outside, which had never once needed to be summoned or earned or chased down through some exhausting effort of will. It had only ever needed an empty enough cup, set out, unhurried, in a sky that had been quietly, patiently falling the entire time, long before the scholar had even thought to ask. He picked up the cup, lifted it slightly, and drank. In the days that followed, before he finally returned to the capital, not to abandon his books, but to carry them differently, a little lighter on his shoulders than before, the scholar found himself returning often to that same simple practice. Each evening, he would empty whatever cup he happened to be holding, set it out beneath whatever sky the day had given him, clear or clouded, and trust that whatever needed to fill it again would find its own way there, in its own time, without his striving. Some evenings it rained, some evenings it did not, and the cup simply sat empty beneath the stars instead, gathering nothing more than starlight, and the quiet, which, the scholar slowly came to feel, was its own kind of filling, every bit as real as rain. He thought, often, of the abbot's first wordless lesson, the cup overflowing, because it had never once been emptied, and understood, more deeply each time he returned to it, that the lesson had never really been about tea or water, or even about books and commentaries at all. It had been about the simple, patient willingness to stop every so often and pour out what no longer served, so that something new, something the old fullness had been quietly blocking the whole time, might finally have room enough to arrive. The night has grown quiet around you now, dear friend, the way it always does, eventually, however long the day insisted on running before it. Perhaps you are already drifting. Perhaps some part of you is still holding on, a little, the way the scholar held his books a little too tightly that first morning on the path. Either way is allowed. Nothing here requires your effort. The moon, somewhere above wherever you are lying right now, is not working to be seen. It is only being itself, quietly, the way it always has. And if the water of your mind can simply grow a little stiller, not by force, not by trying, only by softening, the smallest amount, the way a cup softens when it finally stops being so full of yesterday, the moon's reflection is already there, waiting, exactly as it always was, asking nothing of you except the smallest willingness to let it rest gently on the surface for a while. You do not need to finish the thought that is still circling somewhere at the back of your mind. You do not need to solve tonight what has not been solved in all the nights before it. You do not, dear friend, need to earn this rest by first proving you deserve it. That was never how rest worked. Not for the scholar, not for the farmer and his patient field, not for the bell that could only sing once it stopped being held against the post. You are allowed to simply be the empty cup tonight, set out beneath whatever quiet rain is already, patiently, falling. You do not have to do anything more than that. Not even this. Rest now. The rain already knows the way. There is nothing left for you to carry into the dark but yourself, just as you are, exactly as much as you already are, which has always, quietly, and without your needing to prove it to anyone at all, been enough.